She ran barefoot into the storm with her shoes clutched to her chest, and the whole town's laughter still ringing in her ears, and when she yanked open the carriage door and gasped, "Wrong carriage! Forgive me!" a low voice answered from the dark. The right one, actually. Before you follow Elizabeth Carter's story to the very end, and you will want to see how it ends, take 1 second to subscribe and follow this channel. And tell me in the comments what town you're watching from tonight, because I love seeing just how far this story travels. The rain came down like the sky itself had turned against her. Elizabeth Carter had learned a long time ago how to make herself small. She had learned it the way other girls learned to sew or to dance quietly thoroughly until it became a thing her body did without asking permission. She learned to stand in the corner of a room so still that folks forgot she was there at all. She learned to carry other women's shawls and fetch other women's punch and smile at jokes that were never meant to include her. She had learned all of it. And on this night at the Aldridge summer gathering in the biggest house Loudoun County had to offer, every bit of that learning fell apart in the space of a single sentence. She had been standing near the tall windows, holding a tray she'd been handed by a woman who didn't so much as look at her face when she heard the men laughing by the card tables. $10, one of them said. Young Thomas Aldridge with his father's money in his pockets and none of his father's sense. $10, says not a single respectable man in this room will ask the Carter girl to dance. Not one. That's no wager, said another. That's a certainty. You'd have better luck, a third one said, asking a fella to dance with the coat rack. Least the coat rack's got a shape to it. The laughter that followed was not cruel in the way a slap is cruel. It was worse. It was easy. It was the laughter of men who had never once in all their comfortable lives imagined that the invisible girl in the corner might have ears. Elizabeth stood very still. The tray did not shake in her hands. She would think about that later in the years that came after how her hands had held steady, even while everything underneath her chest came loose all at once. She's what, 4 and 20, someone asked. Older, I'd reckon. And no husband, no prospects, no dowry to speak of. Her daddy left nothing but debt when he passed. Then she ought to be grateful we let her serve the punch. Elizabeth set the tray down. She did it slowly, carefully. She did not want them to hear it, and they did not because to them she made no sound at all coming or going. She walked to the side door, the one the hired help used, and she stepped out into the summer storm with her chin held level and her eyes burning, and not one tear yet fallen because she would not give them that. Not even where they couldn't see. And it was only when she was well down the drive past the last lantern, past the last window full of gold light and warm laughter that she stopped. She bent down. She pulled off her worn shoes because the mud had already ruined them, and she could not afford to ruin them worse, and she held them to her chest like something precious. And then Elizabeth Carter ran. She ran the way she had wanted to run for years and never let herself. She ran until her breath tore ragged in her throat, until the rain plastered her hair flat and soaked her thin dress through, until the fine house behind her was nothing but a smear of light in the wet dark. She ran because if she stopped, she would have to feel it. And near the end of the long drive where the carriages waited in a row for gentlefolk who wouldn't leave for hours. Yet she saw a door. A carriage door dark and closed, and no driver in sight, likely gone to shelter under the eaves with the others. Elizabeth did not think. That was the plain truth of it, and she'd admit it to anyone who asked her later. She did not think at all. She wanted only to be inside something, anything out of the rain and out of the reach of that laughter, and so she seized the handle and hauled the door open and half fell up the step into the dark and dry. "Please," she said before her eyes had even adjusted. "Please just drive. Anywhere. I'll pay what I can. The carriage did not move, and a voice answered her from the shadowed seat across the way. A low voice, calm, unhurried, the way a river is unhurried right before it gets deep. "I'm afraid," the voice said, "you've entered the wrong carriage, miss." Elizabeth went cold. Her eyes found the shape of him. Then a big man, broad through the shoulders, sitting with the ease of somebody who had never in his life needed to make himself small. She could not see his face full, only the line of his jaw and the dark of his hair, but she did not need to see it. She knew that voice. Everybody in 3 counties knew that voice. Nathaniel Harrow, of Harrow Dean. The man who owned more horseflesh and more good bottom land than any 3 families put together. The man who had buried a wife. Nobody had ever seen him grieve the man. They said had not smiled once in 7 years and did not intend to start. And he had a carriage window. He had Elizabeth understood in one sick rush a clear view of that lit drive. Of the side door she'd fled through. Of a soaked, shoeless woman running from a party in the rain like a thief. He had seen everything. "Oh," Elizabeth whispered. She scrambled backward, reaching for the door. Her shoes still clutched against her like they could shield her from anything. Forgive me, sir, I didn't. I'll go. I'll leave you be. I never meant to." "Sit down." It was not sharp. That was the strange part. It was not an order barked at a servant. It was quiet and level, and it stopped her hand on the door as surely as a chain. "Sir, the rain," Nathaniel Harrow said, "is coming down hard enough to drown a man standing up, and you've got no shoes on your feet." A pause. "Sit down, miss. I'll not have it said I turned a woman back out into that." Elizabeth sat, slowly, on the very edge of the seat as far from him as the small space would allow her spine straight, and her hands white-knuckled around the leather of her shoes. "You'll want to dry that off," he said, and something moved in the dark, his hand holding out a folded cloth, a fine one, clean. She stared at it. "I'll ruin it," she said. "It's a handkerchief. It's meant to be ruined." "It's finer than anything I own?" There was a silence then, a long one, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed only a little, only a degree, but she caught it. "Take it," he said. "Please." She took it. She pressed it to her face, to the rain, and to the thing that was not rain that had finally started to come with it, and she was grateful for the dark, because at least he could not see her clearly. At least there was that mercy left. "They'll be looking for their carriage," she managed. "You're the driver. Someone. I've made you a scene. I'm sorry. I'm always—" She stopped herself. "I'm sorry." "No one," said Nathaniel Harrow, "is looking for anything. Half of them are 3 glasses into their evening, and the other half wouldn't notice if this carriage rolled clean off the property." A beat. "And the one man out there who might have noticed is sitting right here." Elizabeth lowered the handkerchief. "Why," she said, "aren't you inside with all of them?" She heard him breathe out, not quite a laugh, something drier than a laugh. "I ask myself that same question," he said, "at every gathering I'm fool enough to attend. But everyone wants—" She stopped again. She had been about to say, "Everyone wants you there." And it was true. She had watched it all evening, before the men and their wager, before everything came apart. She had watched the way the whole room bent toward Nathaniel Harrow, like flowers toward light. The mothers steering their daughters, the fathers angling for a word. The way conversation rose whenever he crossed a room, and how nobody, not one soul, seemed to have the least idea who the man behind the name might actually be. "Everyone wants what?" he asked. And there was something under the question, something that was listening for her answer more closely than a stranger's answer, had any business being listened to. Elizabeth Carter was tired. She was cold and wet, and she had just run out of the worst night of her life. And perhaps that was why she said it plain instead of soft. "Everyone wants your ranch," she said. "Your money, your name on a marriage line, and your signature on a deed." She looked at the dark shape of him. "I don't imagine a great many of them want you." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. It went on so long she thought she'd overstepped past all forgiving. She started to speak, to apologize again. Lord, she had apologized so many times tonight. Her mouth had near worn a groove in the word, and he cut across her. "What's your name?" "Elizabeth." "Carter, sir." "Elizabeth Carter." "Nathaniel Harrow." "I know," she said. Everyone knows." "Yes." And there it was again, that dry knot laugh. "You'll find, Miss Carter, that everyone knowing your name is a mighty different thing from anyone knowing you." Elizabeth turned her face toward him fully, then for the first time. "Yes," she said quietly. "I expect it is." And Nathaniel Harrow, who had not been surprised by another living soul in 7 long years, felt the ground shift under something he'd thought was buried too deep to move. Why? He rapped his knuckles twice against the roof, and the carriage began at last to move. Not fast. The driver would take it slow in this weather. "I'll see you home," he said. "You can't." "I beg your pardon." "You can't see me home." Elizabeth's cheeks went hot, and she was glad again for the dark. "It's the road out to my place isn't fit for a carriage like this, and if anyone saw it, your carriage, at my door." She shook her head. "It'd be the end of me, sir. What little of me there is left to end." "Let them see." "You don't understand?" "Then explain it to me," he said. "We've got the road ahead of us and nothing but rain to fill it. Explain it to me, Miss Carter." And so she did. She did not mean to. She'd meant to sit in polite silence until she could decently escape. But there is something about the dark, and about a voice that only wants to hear you, and not to have anything from you, that pries a body open. She told him about her father. About the farm that had been small but honest, and the debts that had swallowed it whole after he passed, and the way the men who'd shaken his hand at church had come around after the funeral to talk about what he'd owed them, hats in their hands and greed in their eyes. She told him about the years since, about the sewing she took in, and the herbs she grew, and the neighbors she doctored when they couldn't pay for a real physician. Old Mrs. Pruitt's fevers, the Callahan baby that had come sideways and lived anyhow, the Bergen boy's leg she'd set that healed straight as a plumb line. "You set a bone," Nathaniel said. "Somebody had to. Doctor was 2 days' ride and the boy'd have lost the leg." She shrugged in the dark. "It wasn't anything. My mother taught me before she passed. She had the gift for it. I only remember what she showed me." "That," he said slowly, "is not nothing, Miss Carter. It is to them." Her voice went flat. "That's the part you don't understand, sir, so let me say it plain, since we've the road ahead of us. In that house tonight, I am not a woman who sets bones, and brings down fevers, and keeps 3 families from burying their dead. I am the Carter girl, with no dowry, and no husband, and a plain face. And that is the whole of what I am to any of them." She swallowed. "There were men in there tonight, betting on me. Whether any respectable man alive would so much as dance with me. $10 they said that none would." She heard her own voice crack and hated it. "They called me the coat rack. They said it had more shape." The carriage rolled on through the rain. "What are their names?" Nathaniel Harrow asked. And something in how he asked it low and even and cold in a way that had nothing to do with unkindness made Elizabeth turn sharp toward him. "Don't," she said. "I only asked their names." "You ask their names the way a man asks who he intends to ruin." She shook her head hard. "No, no, sir. That is exactly the thing. Don't you see, if Nathaniel Harrow rides into that party tomorrow and shames Thomas Aldridge over a serving girl, then I'm your serving girl. I'm the thing you fought over. I'm smaller than I was before, not bigger." She pressed the handkerchief flat between her palms. "I have been made small my whole life by other people's kindness near as much as their cruelty. Please, don't do it too." Nathaniel Harrow did not answer for a long moment. "You are," he said finally, "the strangest woman I have ever shared a carriage with." "I'm the only woman you've ever shared a carriage with by mistake, I'd wager." "That's a low bar, sir." And Nathaniel Harrow laughed. It came out of him rough and unpracticed, the sound of a thing long out of use, and he seemed near as startled by it as she was. He put a hand briefly over his mouth as if to catch it, and put it back. "Well," he said when he'd recovered, "I'll be." "What?" "Nothing." A pause. "It's only I hadn't done that in some while." Laughed. He agreed. Elizabeth studied the dark shape of him, and some of the fear that had ridden her since she first fell into that carriage began at last to loosen its grip. "Why not?" she asked, gently this time. "If you don't mind my asking. A man with everything you've got." What's a man like that got to be so sorrowful over? She heard him shift on the seat. You said it yourself, he said. Not half an hour ago. You said not a great many of them want me. A breath. You want to know the truth of it, Miss Carter? Not a one of them ever has. Not the whole of my life. My father wanted an heir. The girls' fathers want my land. My late wife... He stopped. You don't have to... My late wife... He went on, and his voice was very steady, too steady. Wanted to be mistress of Harrowdene. She got her wish. She wore it well right up until the fever took her, and I stood at her grave, and I felt, Lord forgive me, I felt like a man standing at the grave of a stranger, because that's what we were. Strangers who'd signed the same paper. He was quiet. 7 years folks have been telling me I ought to grieve harder. And the terrible thing, Miss Carter, the thing I've never said aloud to a living soul, is that I couldn't grieve a woman I never once knew. And I have hated myself for it every day since. The carriage rolled on. That's not a terrible thing, Elizabeth said softly. It is. No. She was surprised at how sure she sounded. It's a lonesome thing. There's a difference, though. I'll grant you they wear the same coat. She turned toward him. You didn't fail to grieve her because your heart's gone hard, Mr. Harrow. You failed to grieve her because nobody ever let the two of you be anything worth grieving. You were a deed and a name to her, and she was a mistress and a match to you, and neither one of you was ever given the chance to be a person to the other. That's not your sin. That's a sorrow that was done to you, both of you. Silence. Then very quietly from the dark. How old did you say you were? 24. You talk. Nathaniel Harrow said, like a woman 3 times that. Like a woman who's already buried her own share. I've buried some, Elizabeth said. You don't have to be old to bury things. You only have to be alone with them long enough. The carriage slowed. This isn't my road, Elizabeth said, sitting up. No. Mr. Harrow. There's a cook at Harrowdene, he said, name of Mrs. Doyle, who's been trying to feed me since I was a boy, and has had precious little to work with these last years. There's a fire that's like as not still burning in the kitchen, and there's a storm out there fit to sink an ark. He said it plainly. You'll not go home tonight into that in a wet dress with no shoes. Mrs. Doyle will find you something dry and something hot, and a room with a good lock on the door, and in the morning when the roads are fit, I'll see you home myself, or send you with a driver, whichever suits you. A pause. You've my word, nothing improper is meant by it. And if my word's not enough, which it has no cause to be, you scarcely know me, then Mrs. Doyle sleeps light and hits hard, and she'll not leave your side. Elizabeth sat very still. Why? She asked. And this time the word came out thin, near frightened, because kindness frightened her worse than cruelty ever had. Cruelty she understood. Cruelty had rules. Why would you do any of this? You don't know me. An hour passed you didn't know I was alive. And Nathaniel Harrow was quiet for a moment before he answered, because for the first time and longer than I can rightly recall, he said, I've sat across from a person who wanted nothing from me. Not my land, not my name, not 1 red cent. His voice was low. You fell into my carriage by mistake, Miss Carter, and you have spent the last half hour trying to give me back a handkerchief and apologizing for taking up my air. And in that time you have seen more of me, the true and sorry whole of me, than a woman I was married to for 6 years ever troubled herself to look for. A beat. I don't rightly know how to repay a thing like that, but a dry room and a hot meal seems the least a decent man could offer, so let me offer it. The rain drummed on the roof. You keep saying I want nothing from you, Elizabeth said at last, very quiet. But that's not so, Mr. Harrow. No. No? She looked at him through the dark. I want you to laugh again. That's all. Not for me. I heard it just now, and it was such a young sound from a man who's forgotten he ever was young. And I thought that's a shame. That's a plain shame, a laugh like that, all locked up in a house with no one to hear it. She looked down at her hands. So there. Now you can't say it isn't true. I do want something from you after all. I want you to laugh. And in the dark of the carriage, Nathaniel Harrow of Harrowdean looked at the shoeless, soaked, unwanted woman across from him. The coat rack they'd called her the forgettable Carter girl, the one no respectable man would cross a room for, and he felt the last 7 years crack straight down the middle, like river ice in a thaw. "Miss Carter," he said, and his voice was not quite steady now, and he did not try to make it so. "I believe that is the finest thing anyone has asked of me in a very long while. A breath. And I aim to see that you get it." And Mrs. Doyle met them at the kitchen door, with a lantern held high and her nightcap askew, and an expression that shifted in the space of 1 second, from alarm to astonishment, to a fierce and instant tenderness, the moment the lantern light fell on Elizabeth's face. "Lord have mercy," she said. "Look at the state of her, wet to the bone and shaking like a foal. Get in here, child. Get in, no, don't you mind the floor. The floor's seen worse than a bit of rain." She rounded on Nathaniel with the ease of a woman who had swatted him with a wooden spoon in his own kitchen more than once. "And what were you about, Nathaniel Harrow, keeping a girl out in that, have you no, I found her, Mrs. Doyle. I didn't make the storm." "Found her." The cook sniffed already, steering Elizabeth toward the great warm hearth, already reaching for a kettle. "Well, you did one sensible thing tonight at least, bringing her here." She looked back at him sharp. "That's more'n I've been able to say of you most nights this year." "Mrs. Doyle, sit down, child. There, closer to the fire." The cook wrapped a wool blanket round Elizabeth's shoulders and pressed it tight, and when Elizabeth flinched at the sudden warmth of being cared for, gentled her voice all at once. There now, sweet girl. You're safe here. Whatever it was out there, it don't reach in here. You hear me?" And Elizabeth Carter, who had held her chin level and her eyes dry through the worst humiliation of her life, who had not wept before the men who mocked her, or on the long drive, or even alone in the storm. Elizabeth Carter put her face in her hands and finally broke. She wept for the wager and the laughter and the coat rack. She wept for her father and the farm and the years of being invisible in the corner of every warm room in the county. She wept the way a person weeps when a kindness undoes them worse than any cruelty could, and Mrs. Doyle held her through it and made low soothing sounds, and shot one long meaningful look over the girl's bent head at the man standing silent in the doorway. And Nathaniel Harrow did not leave. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, a man worth more than any 3 families in the county, a man who had forgotten how to laugh and had not grieved his own dead wife, and he watched a stranger fall apart at his hearth. And he did not feel the pull to be anywhere else. He did not feel the restlessness that had ridden him for 7 years through every fine room he owned. He felt for the first time in longer than he could name that he was standing in exactly the place he ought to be. "Mrs. Doyle?" he said quietly. "Hush," said the cook. "Can't you see the girl's spent?" "The blue room. The one with the good lock. See, she's comfortable." He paused. "And Mrs. Doyle. In the morning, she's not to be sent off before I've spoken to her. You understand me?" Something in his voice made the old cook look up sharp. She had known Nathaniel Harrow since he was a boy in short pants. She had watched him grow hard and grow rich, and grow so lonesome she'd near given up on him. And she heard in those few plain words a thing she had not heard in his voice in more years than she cared to count. She heard hope. "I," Mrs. Doyle said softly, "I understand you, Nathaniel." And then, gentler still, "Go on to bed. I've got her. I've got the poor thing. You go on." He went, but at the foot of the stairs he stopped, and he turned back, and across the warm kitchen he found Elizabeth's tear-streaked face in the firelight. "Miss Carter." She looked up. "You asked me tonight why I wasn't inside," he said. "At the party. With all of them." A pause. "I've been turning it over, and I believe I've got your answer now." "What is it?" "I was waiting," Nathaniel Harrow said, "for the right carriage." And the ghost of that young, unpracticed laugh crossed his weathered face there and gone like sun through storm cloud. Seems it came to me in the end, wrong door and all. And Elizabeth Carter, wrapped in a stranger's blanket by a stranger's fire, watched the loneliest man in 3 counties climb the stairs of his great empty house, and understood with a certainty that frightened her more than anything the whole cruel night had thrown at her, that the woman who had run out into that storm to disappear had somehow impossibly been seen instead. Outside, the rain went on falling. But inside, for the first time in a very long time, the great house at Harrowdean was not empty. And neither of them lying awake in their separate rooms while the storm spent itself against the windows could have said which of the 2 of them had been more thoroughly rescued that night. The woman who fell into the carriage, or the man who had for 7 long years been waiting for someone to open the door. Dawn came gray and washed clean, and Elizabeth Carter was awake to meet it, because she had never in her life let herself be found sleeping in another person's house. She had laced her dress dry now, stiff where the mud had set, but dry, and she had made the bed so neat you'd never have known a soul had lain in it, and she had her ruined shoes in her hand and her hand on the door before she'd let herself think too hard about the shape of what she meant to do, which was leave. Before the house woke. Before anybody had to decide in the plain light of morning what to do with the Carter girl who'd fallen into the wrong carriage. She got the door open without a sound. She got 3 steps down the hall. "Now where?" said Mrs. Doyle from a chair set square in the middle of that hallway where she had plainly been sitting the whole night through. "Do you reckon you're going?" Elizabeth's heart near stopped in her chest. She pressed the shoes against her skirt. You were only sneaking off before the sun was fair up is what you were only." Mrs. Doyle rose from the chair with a groan for her knees and a look on her face that would have stopped a charging bull. "In a dress that ain't but half dry on a road that's near washed out with no breakfast in you and no shoes worth the name on your feet. That about the size of it." "I can't stay. You know I can't. It's not a woman like me in a house like this. It isn't. A woman like you." The cook said it slow, tasting it, not liking the flavor. "And what kind is that then?" Elizabeth's mouth opened. Closed. "The kind that gets talked about," she said finally. "The kind that ruins a good man's name by so much as standing in his hall. He was kind to me, kinder than anybody's been in years. And the way I'd repay him is to be found here at breakfast so the whole county could make a filthy story of it. No, I won't do it. I'll walk out the kitchen before the hands are up and no one need ever know He's already up." That stopped her. "He's up," Mrs. Doyle said again, softer now. "And been up. Been up since before I was, and that's saying something, for I don't sleep but a few hours these days. He's down in the kitchen this very minute, child sitting at that table, like a man who don't know what to do with his own 2 hands, waiting on you." The old woman's eyes were shrewd. "Now you can go sneaking out the back and break that. Or you can come down them stairs and let a man buy you a hot breakfast in thanks for not robbing him blind while he slept, which is more than most of his guests can say." She held out her arm. "Come on, I don't bite. Not you anyhow." And Elizabeth, who had steeled herself against cruelty her whole life, and had no armor at all for this, followed the old woman down. Nathaniel Harrow stood the moment she came through the door. He stood too fast, the way a man stands when he's forgotten he meant to be dignified about it, and the chair scraped loud against the flags, and for a moment the 3 of them just held there, the cook in the doorway, the girl frozen on the threshold, and the richest man in 3 counties standing at his own kitchen table with his hands not knowing where to go. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Harrow. You slept?" "Some. Good." He gestured at the table at the place already laid the bread and the eggs and the coffee steaming. "Sit, please, before Mrs. Doyle takes it as a personal wound. I ought to be going. Truly, You ought to eat first." He said it plain, not pushing. "The road'll still be there in an hour. It's a poor host lets a woman walk out hungry, and I've few enough virtues, Miss Carter. Let me keep the ones I've got." She sat. She ate at first the way she did everything in another person's house, small, careful, taking up as little as a body could. And then the food was warm and good, and she had run herself hollow the night before, and somewhere between the bread and the second cup, she forgot to be small. And Mrs. Doyle caught Nathaniel's eye across the room and gave him a look that said, plain as speech there now, and turned back to her stove, so neither of them would have to see her satisfaction. "I'll have Samuel drive you," Nathaniel said when she'd near finished. "In the covered wagon, not the carriage. Nobody'll look twice at a farm wagon." A pause. Unless. He turned his coffee cup a slow half circle on the table. A man working up to a thing. "You told me last night, G," he said, "that you doctor folks. Set the Bergen boy's leg. Brought the Callahan child through crossways. Nursed old Mrs. Pruitt's fevers when the physician was 2 days out. I did tell you that." "Wary now." "Why?" "Because I've a man on this ranch," Nathaniel said. "Name of Eli Renner. Been with me 11 years. Best hand I've got, and the nearest thing to a friend a man in my position's allowed to keep." His jaw worked. "His girls took sick. 4 days now. The little one Mercy, she's 6. Fever that won't break, and a cough gone down into her chest. And the doctor rode out from town 2 days past, looked at her the length of a breath and said—" He stopped. "Said what?" Elizabeth asked. "Said there was naught to be done. Said to keep her comfortable." His voice went flat and hard. "Said it in front of the child's mother. And took his fee and rode back to town and left a family to sit up nights waiting on a thing he'd already decided couldn't be stopped." Elizabeth had set her cup down before he finished. 4 days of fever," she said, "in a child of 6, and a cough down into the chest. Aye, and this doctor, what did he leave her? What's he got her taking?" "Nothing that I know of. Told them to pray near as I can tell." Elizabeth was already on her feet. "Where is she?" Nathaniel blinked. "Miss Carter, you asked me if I doctor folk Mr. Harrow, and then you told me there's a 6-year-old with a chest fever 4 days gone, and no medicine in her, and no one but a mother sitting up praying. So don't ask me now like it's a favor you're begging. Ask me where she is, because there's a difference of an hour or two in a thing like this, and we've likely already lost the last several days." Her voice had changed entire, gone brisk, and certain a voice that gave orders and expected them followed. "Mrs. Doyle, I'll need hot water as much as you can spare, and keep coming. Honey, if you've got it. Vinegar, a clean sheet. And onions, as many onions as this house holds. I'm not joking. Fetch me every onion you've got." Mrs. Doyle, who had run this kitchen for 40 years and taken orders from precisely no one, was already moving. "Onions?" the cook said half to herself. "She wants onions," and reached for her basket with something close to glee. "Miss Carter." Nathaniel had come round the table. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She rounded on him, and there was a fire in her he hadn't seen the night before, a thing that had been buried under all that apologizing, all that smallness, all those years of standing in corners. "Nobody ever has to. That's how children die, Mr. Harrow. Because everybody who could have helped decided it wasn't theirs to have to." She snatched up the ruined shoes and jammed her feet into them, mud and all. "Now, are you going to take me to that child, or are you going to stand here being grateful at me while she drowns in her own chest?" For a moment, Nathaniel Harrow only looked at her. And then, God help him, he near smiled. "Samuel," he bellowed toward the yard, "saddle nothing, hitch the light wagon and be quick. We're going to Eli's." The Renner place was a neat cabin a quarter-mile down the ranch road, and Sarah Renner met them at the door with a face gone gray from 4 sleepless nights. And when she saw who Nathaniel had brought, a strange woman in a mud-caked dress, with her sleeves already shoved up past the elbow, she near shut the door on them. "Mr. Harrow, we don't need no more, Sarah." Nathaniel's voice was gentle in a way Elizabeth was learning he kept only for a few. "This is Miss Carter. She doctors. She's set bones and broke fevers, and I'd not have brought her if I didn't. The doctor already said." "I know what the doctor said." Elizabeth stepped forward, and she did not push past the woman, did not crowd her. She stopped a respectful pace off and looked her dead in the eye, mother to woman. "Mrs. Renner, I'm going to say a hard thing, and I'm going to say it fast because your girl doesn't have the time for me to say it soft. The doctor told you there's nothing to be done. He was wrong. He might not have been lying. He might have just been lazy or beat or wrong, but he was wrong. Because I have brought children through worse than a 4-day chest fever, with nothing but onions and steam, and somebody willing to sit up and fight for them. Her voice caught just once. I lost my own mother to a fever when I was near your girl's age, and I have spent every year since learning how to stop it happening to somebody else's child. So please, please, Mrs. Renner, let me try. If I'm wrong, you've lost nothing but an hour. And if I'm right, Sarah Renner stepped back from the door. The child was worse than Elizabeth had feared. Little Mercy Renner lay in a tangle of sweat-damp sheets, her small chest heaving each breath, a wet and rattling labor. Her skin gone, the dull hot red of a fever that had settled in for the kill. Elizabeth crossed to her in 3 strides and laid the back of her hand to the child's brow and her ear to the small heaving chest, and her face, when she straightened, did not have one scrap of hope in it that she let the mother see. But her hands were already moving. "All right," she said. "All right, sweet girl, all right. We're going to get you some air back." And to the room at large, sharp, Mrs. Doyle sent the onions. "In the wagon. Fetch them. Sarah, Mrs. Renner, I need you at the stove. Water boiling and a steady steam coming. We're going to make this whole room a kettle." She was slicing onions before she'd finished speaking, laying them thick and raw across a clean cloth. "Mr. Harrow, get your coat off and be useful. I need her up. I can't clear that chest with her lying flat. She's got to be up against something. You'll be the something. Sit behind her, hold her up against you, and don't you move for the next hour, no matter what, you hear me. Not for anything." And Nathaniel Harrow, richest man in 3 counties, took off his fine coat and climbed onto a sick child's cot in a ranch hand's cabin and gathered a fevered 6-year-old up against his chest and held her and did not move. What followed Elizabeth would tell no one about after, because there was nothing in it that made a good story, only the long, ugly grind of it. The onion poultice laid steaming to the child's chest and changed again, the steam thickening the air till their own clothes hung damp. The honey and vinegar dripped past the child's cracked lips, a spoonful at a time. Elizabeth's voice going on low and endless, a stream of nothing words. "There now. That's it. Breathe for me. One more good girl. That's my good, brave girl." Sarah Renner, weeping silent at the stove and feeding the fire. And Nathaniel still as stone, the sick child's head tucked under his chin, murmuring to her too, when the coughing fits took her clumsy. Unpracticed, a man who had not comforted a living soul in 7 years, relearning the shape of it in a single terrible hour. And then past noon, the fever broke. It broke all at once, the way they do the child, going from furnace hot to soaked and shivering in the space of a few minutes, and the wet rattle in her chest loosening, till Mercy Renner drew one long, clean breath that did not fight her, and another, and turned her small, damp face into Nathaniel Harrow's shirt, and for the first time in 4 days, slept. Truly slept. Not the burning half-death of the fever. Sleep. Sarah Renner made a sound like her heart had come out of her and dropped to her knees at the cot, and Elizabeth caught her before she could wake the child, held the weeping woman against her, and rocked her the way she'd rocked the girl. "She'll want watching 2 more days, Elizabeth said low over the mother's shaking shoulders. "The fever could come back, and I'll not lie to you about that. But it broke clean, and that cough's loosening, and she took the honey, and she's sleeping true. Mrs. Renner, Sarah, look at me. Your girl is going to live." And over the mother's bent head, Elizabeth Carter looked up and found Nathaniel Harrow watching her, a sleeping child in his arms, his fine shirt soaked through with sweat and onion, and a stranger child's fever tears standing plain and unashamed in the eyes of a man the whole county swore had none, and neither one of them said a word because there wasn't one worth saying. Word of a thing like that does not stay in a cabin. By the time the wagon rolled back up to the main house, half the ranch already knew. Eli Renner had come in from the far pasture at a dead gallop the moment somebody rode to fetch him, and he'd stood in his own doorway and watched his daughter sleeping easy for the first time in 4 nights, And then he'd come and found Elizabeth, where she stood scrubbing onion off her hands at the pump, and the big man had tried 3 times to say a thing and couldn't get it past his own throat. "Mr. Renner?" Elizabeth said gently. "You don't have to." "I do, though." His voice was a wreck. "That doctor, that town doctor, he looked at my Mercy, and he said, 'Keep her comfortable, ma'am. Keep her comfortable. Like she was already—'" He scrubbed a hand hard across his face. "And you never even met her. You never met a one of us. And you got down on your knees in my house, and you fought for her like she was your own blood." He shook his head helpless. "I ain't got the words. I ain't a man that's got the words. But there ain't a thing on God's earth you could ask of me from this day to the last one that I wouldn't do. You hear, not one thing. Not, and that though none of them knew it yet, standing there by the pump in the afternoon light, was the moment the whole shape of what was coming got set. Because Eli Renner was not just any hand. He was the best-liked man on the place, and he had 11 years of friends among the ranch families. And by supper, every soul at Harrowdene knew that the strange woman Mr. Harrow had brought home in the storm had done what the town doctor wouldn't, had saved little Mercy Renner with her own 2 hands, and had asked not one thing in return. The woman the town called a coat rack. By nightfall, they had a different name for her at Harrowdene entirely. They called her the one who came in the storm. She meant to leave the next morning. She said as much to Mrs. Doyle over breakfast, and Mrs. Doyle said, in the tone of a woman who has heard a fool notion and is choosing not to waste breath fighting it yet. And Elizabeth might have gone through with it too, except that she made the mistake of going up to check on Mercy one last time, just once more, just to be sure the fever hadn't turned, and by the time she'd walked the 1/4 mile back, it was noon, and there was a girl waiting for her with a boil that wanted lancing, and an old man wanting something for his joints, and Sarah Renner asking shy if maybe Miss Carter would look at Eli's hand, where he'd caught it on the fence wire, and it had gone red and angry round the edges. "That's fixing to poison," Elizabeth said sharply, taking Eli's hand in both of hers. "How long's it been like this? Week, maybe." "A week. You great fool of a man, you fought a fever with me not 2 days back, and never said your own hand was going bad." She was already reaching for hot water. "Sit." And so the 2nd day passed, and she did not leave, nor the 3rd. By the 4th day, without anybody quite deciding it, there was a corner of the great kitchen that had become Elizabeth's, a shelf of her drying herbs, a scrubbed table where folk came to be doctored, a line forming most mornings of ranch hands and their wives and their children, who had learned in the space of a week that there was a woman at the big house who would fix what ailed them and never once make them feel small for the asking. She was happier than she had been in years. She admitted that to herself late on the 4th night, lying awake in the blue room, and it frightened her worse than any fever, because she knew what happiness was. Happiness was a thing that got taken. And Nathaniel Harrow had taken to finding reasons. He found a reason to be in the kitchen most mornings when her line formed, standing back against the wall with his coffee, saying nothing, only watching her work, watching the way the whole hard weight of her seemed to lift when she had a body to help, watching her laugh with the children, watching her scold Eli Renner like a brother, and gentle a frightened girl like a mother. He found reasons to ask her opinion on things a landowner had no earthly cause to ask a doctoring woman about: the state of the workers' cabins, whether the wells were clean, why it was the Farr family's children were always the sickest. And Elizabeth, who did not know she was being courted because no one had ever thought her worth the trouble, answered him plain and true, and told him the Farr cabins had bad water, and no way to keep it, and the roofs leaked, and a family that's cold and damp all winter is a family that's sick all winter, and it wasn't the Lord's doing. Mr. Harrow, it was the roofing. He had the roofs fixed inside a fortnight. He said it was good sense. He said a sick hand can't work, and a dead hand can't be replaced for love nor money. And it was plain economy, and Elizabeth let him say it, and Mrs. Doyle caught her eye across the kitchen and said not one word, and the two women understood each other perfectly. He's not the man they say he is. Elizabeth said to the cook one evening, low watching Nathaniel cross the yard toward the stables in the long gold light. "No," said Mrs. Doyle. "He ain't. They call him cold. He learned to be. There's a difference, though. Folk don't trouble to make it." The old woman set down her mixing bowl. "You want to know the whole of it, child, I'll tell you, since you're near the only soul he's let close in 7 years, and you ought to know what you're standing near." She lowered her voice. "That wife of his, the one everybody says he never grieved. You want to know why he never grieved her? He told me some of it, in the carriage." "Did he?" Mrs. Doyle looked surprised, and then not. "Well, then you know more than most. But I'll wager he didn't tell you the last of it, because he don't tell it to nobody. So mind you don't let on," I said. She wiped her hands. "That marriage was made for him, child, made by his daddy on his deathbed. Old Mr. Harrow, he built this place up from near nothing, and he was terrified, plain terrified of it going to ruin after he passed. So he made the boy promise, made him swear to marry the Aldridge girl and join the 2 spreads and keep the whole thing safe." Her mouth thinned. "The boy was 22. He'd have promised his own soul to a dying father, so he married her. And she was a cold thing, that first wife, no fault to her, she was made for it, same as him. And they lived like 2 strangers in this great house for 6 years. And then the fever took her, and he stood at her grave and felt nothing, and every soul in the county has held it against him since." She fixed Elizabeth with a hard look. "So when you hear tell that Nathaniel Harrow's got no heart, you remember, it ain't that he's got no heart, child. It's that he gave it away once on a deathbed before he was ever old enough to know what he was signing off on. And he's spent every year since believing he don't get to want a thing of his own. That's your cold man. That's the whole of him." Elizabeth was quiet a long moment. "The Aldridge girl," she said finally. "You said he married the Aldridge girl." "Aye, Cordelia's older sister. She's the one that passed." Mrs. Doyle's eyes were sharp. "Why?" "No reason," Elizabeth said, but her hands had gone still, because she knew that name. Aldridge. She had heard it not 2 weeks past in a fine warm room in the mouths of laughing men. $10 says not a single respectable man will ask the Carter girl to dance. Thomas Aldridge, who'd made the wager. Thomas Aldridge, whose family's whole fortune had been meant to join with Harrowdene through a marriage that death had cut short. She did not yet understand what that meant. She would, and soon, and it would nearly cost her everything. It came on a Tuesday in the shape of a fine carriage and a finer visitor, and Elizabeth was in her kitchen corner with a child's splinter half out of its thumb when she heard the commotion in the yard, and Mrs. Doyle went to the window and said in a voice gone suddenly flat and careful, "Well, speak of the devil and hear his carriage wheels." "Who is it?" "Silas Aldridge," said the cook, "and his daughter. Come calling." Elizabeth's needle stopped against the child's thumb. "Finish that," Mrs. Doyle said quick and low. "Finish it and get on up the back stairs and stay there. You hear me, child? These ain't folk you want to be found among. Not you, not here. Go on." But Elizabeth did not go up the back stairs. She would ask herself in the days to come why she hadn't. Whether it was pride or foolishness, or some hard, bright thing in her that had woken up the night she walked out into that storm and would not lie back down. She finished the child's thumb, and she sent the child running. And then she stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the great front hall, half in shadow unseen, and she watched Silas Aldridge sweep into Nathaniel Harrow's house like a man come to collect on a debt. He was a big, ruddy, handsome man, gone soft at the middle, and he had his daughter on his arm, and the daughter. The daughter was beautiful. There was no lying about it. Cordelia Aldridge was everything Elizabeth Carter was not, gold-haired and creamy-skinned and dressed in a summer silk that cost more than the whole Renner cabin, and she moved through the hall with the easy, careless grace of a woman who has never once in her life been made to feel small. "Nathaniel!" boomed Silas, seizing Nathaniel's hand and pumping it. My boy, it's been an age. You keep to this ranch of yours like a hermit, I swear it. Cordelia was only saying, weren't you, my dear, that Mr. Harrow's grown quite the recluse." "Mr. Aldridge." Nathaniel's voice, Elizabeth noted, had gone back to the flat, cold thing it had been that first night in the carriage. The mask. "Miss Aldridge, this is unexpected." "Nonsense. We're near family," said Silas. "Or ought to be, and that's the very thing I've come about, but there's no rushing these matters, no rushing them. Cordelia, greet the man properly." "Mr. Harrow." Cordelia gave a small, perfect curtsy and a smile that had been practiced in a mirror. "You look well. Solitude suits you, it seems. Though it can't be good for a man, all this rattling about a great house alone." "I manage. Do you—" She let her gaze drift about the hall, cool and assessing a woman pricing the furniture. "It's a beautiful house. It only wants a woman's touch, I always say. Something warmer. Don't you find it dreadfully empty, Mr. Harrow?" And from the shadow of the doorway, Elizabeth watched Nathaniel Harrow's jaw go tight, and she understood all at once the whole of it, the way you understand a thing that's been staring at you for days. Exactly what Silas Aldridge had come to his house to do. He'd come to finish what death had interrupted. One Aldridge daughter had joined her family to Harrowdean, and the fever had taken her before she could give them an heir to seal it. And here was the next daughter. And here was a widower grown lonesome and rich, and Silas plainly reckoned ripe. The two spreads joined at last. The old bargain honored. Everything the way the fathers had wanted it. Elizabeth's stomach turned over. Not for herself. She told herself that fiercely, standing there in the shadow. Not for herself, because she had no claim. She was a doctoring woman who'd fallen into his carriage by mistake. She had no right on this earth to feel the thing she was feeling. Watching that beautiful woman price Nathaniel Harrow's haul like a side of beef. But she felt it anyway, and it near took her legs out from under her. "Silas," Nathaniel was saying, "if you've come about the North Tract, I told your man in the spring that land's not for—" "Business, business, always business with you Harrows." Silas laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "No, my boy, though we'll speak of the North Tract before I go, mark me. No, I've come on a happier errand." He drew Cordelia forward. "I've come because it's been 3 years since we lost our dear Amelia. God rest her. And a man can't mourn forever, and a house can't stand empty forever, and there's a well. There's a fitness to things, Nathaniel, a rightness. Your father saw it. My family saw it. And I'll not pretend I've forgotten what was near to being before the good Lord took our Amelia from us both." The hall went very quiet. "Mr. Aldridge," Nathaniel said low, "Cordelia's of age now, and more than fond of you, aren't you, my dear—" "Father?" Cordelia's cheeks pinked prettily on cue. "Bah. And I say, why should two grieving families not find comfort where their fathers always meant them to? Why should Harrowdean not have its mistress at last?" Silas spread his hands wide, a man offering a gift. "I'm not a subtle man, Nathaniel, never have been, so I'll say it plain. Marry my Cordelia. Join the spreads as your father and I always dreamed, and be done with rattling round this great cold house alone." And there it was, out in the open air of the hall. Elizabeth Carter stood frozen in the shadow of the doorway and waited with her heart in her throat to hear what the loneliest man in 3 counties, the man who'd been raised to believe he didn't get to want a thing of his own, would say. For a long moment, Nathaniel Harrow said nothing at all. And in that nothing, Silas Aldridge's confident smile began by slow degrees to falter. "Silas," Nathaniel said at last, "you'll forgive me if I speak as plain as you have. Of course, of course. I'll not marry your daughter." The words dropped into the hall like a stone into a still pond. Cordelia's practiced smile froze. Silas's ruddy face went a shade ruddier. Now, my boy, there's no call to be hasty, these things want. There's nothing hasty in it. It's a thing I've known my own mind on for years." Nathaniel's voice never rose, and somehow that made it worse. "I married one daughter because my father made me swear to on his deathbed before I was old enough to know what I was giving up. And I honored it. 6 years I honored it, and I'll not speak ill of Amelia. She kept her end of a bargain. Neither of us chose. But she's 3 years in the ground. Silas and the bargain died with her, and I'll be damned before I sign myself over to another arrangement, I never asked for to please the ghost of my father and the greed of yours. Greed. Silas swelled up like a bullfrog. Now you look here, Harrow. I've looked here my whole life. That's the trouble. Nathaniel turned, and his eyes swept the hall, and for one terrible instant they found the shadow of the doorway, and found Elizabeth in it. And she saw him see her, and her heart stopped dead. But his face did not change, and his eyes moved on, and she understood that he would not give her away, not to these people, not for anything. I'll say it once more so there's no mistaking it. I am done being a thing that's traded. I'll not marry to join two spreads. If ever I marry again in this life, Silas, it'll be to a woman I've chosen. A woman who wanted me before she ever knew what I was worth. And with all respect to your daughter, a small, cold nod toward Cordelia. That is a thing no arrangement on this earth can furnish. The silence after was total. And then Cordelia Aldridge, who was not it, turned out entirely the ornament she played at being spoke into it in a voice gone suddenly sharp and low. There's someone. Nathaniel's eyes cut to her. There is, Cordelia said slowly, and something ugly and clever was waking up behind her lovely face. Isn't there? All this fine talk of choosing? A man doesn't grow a spine like that overnight, Mr. Harrow, not after 7 years a hermit. Someone's put it there. Her gaze began deliberately to travel the hall, to move toward the kitchen doorway, where the shadows were. Father, they say the strangest thing in town. They say Nathaniel Harrow's taken in a woman. Some nobody he found in the rain. Keeps her at the ranch. Has her... The word came out dripping. Doctoring his hands, if you'll credit it. Silas's head came up like a hound's. What woman? I don't know. Some ragged nothing. A carter, I think they said. Cordelia's eyes had nearly reached the doorway. The kind of woman a man's ashamed to be seen with in daylight, so he keeps her in the dark of a great house where... That's enough. Nathaniel had moved. He had put himself in one stride square between the Aldridges and the kitchen door, between them and the shadow where Elizabeth stood with her whole body gone to ice, and his voice when it came was no longer flat and cold at all. It had gone quiet in the other way. The dangerous way. The way of a big man who has been patient a long time and has just decided to stop. You'll speak of my household, he said, with respect, or you'll speak of it from the far side of my gate. Nathaniel. Silas began alarmed now. There is a woman under this roof, Nathaniel said, and every word was cut from stone, who 4 days ago got down on her knees in Eli Renner's cabin and pulled his 6-year-old daughter back from a death your fine town doctor had already signed off on. She has asked me for nothing, not a coin, not a comfort, not a promise. She has healed half this ranch with her own 2 hands and slept in a locked room and meant to walk home in the rain rather than cost me 1 word of my precious reputation. He took a step forward, and Silas took 1 back. And you come into my house, and you call her a ragged nothing, and you say it a shame to be seen with her. You who let your own son bet $10 in a public room that no decent man would so much as dance with her, because I have heard that story too, Silas. I have heard exactly the kind of men your family breeds. His voice dropped lower still. So do not stand in my hall and tell me who I ought to be ashamed of. I know precisely who shames me, and it is not the woman in that kitchen. You could have heard a pin drop on the far side of the county, and Elizabeth Carter, pressed to the wall in the dark of the doorway, with her hand over her own mouth, felt something break open in her chest that had been sealed shut so long she'd forgotten it was there at all. No one had ever done that. In 24 years of being the coat rack, the nobody, the girl in the corner, no one had ever once stood up in a bright hall full of powerful people and put their own name between her and the world. And that was the exact moment she knew she had to leave. Because she had heard, too, the thing that Nathaniel maybe hadn't. She had heard Silas Aldridge's silence turn from bluster to something colder and more calculating. She had watched from the shadow the way the man's ruddy face had gone still and thoughtful. The face of a man who has been refused a thing he came for and is already working out how to make the refuser pay. She waited in the dark until the Aldridges had gone. Silas stiff and formal at the door, muttering about the North Tract. And we'll speak again. Harrow, when you've come to your senses. Cordelia, not troubling to hide her fury. And then she waited until she heard the carriage wheels fade down the drive, and then she came out of the doorway, and she found Nathaniel standing alone in the middle of his great hall, with his back to her, his shoulders set like a man who has just carried something heavy a long way. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. He turned. "You were listening. The whole county could have listened. You weren't quiet about it." Her voice was shaking and she couldn't stop it. "Mr. Harrow, you just made an enemy of the most powerful family in 3 counties. Over a doctoring woman you've known a fortnight. I made an enemy of a man who deserved it. You made an enemy of a man who'll ruin you." It burst out of her. "Don't you understand what you've done? A man like Silas Aldridge doesn't forget a thing like that. He'll go back to town and he'll make it a story. He'll make it filthy. The rich widower and the ragged woman he keeps in the dark, and every soul that ever wanted a reason to tear you down will have one now, and it'll be me, Nathaniel. I'll be the reason. I'll be the thing they use to bring you low." She was crying now and hating it. "That's what I am. I'm the coat rack. I'm the joke they made in a fine room. And now I'll be the joke they make of you, and I won't be that. I won't be the thing that costs you everything you've got." Elizabeth. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. It stopped her cold. "You listen to me now," Nathaniel said, and he crossed the hall to her slow, the way a man crosses to a spooked horse. "You've spent your whole life being told what you are by people who never once bothered to look at you, and you've believed them. That's the sorrow of it, you've believed them so long. You say their words for them now, so they don't even have to. The coat rack, the joke, the nobody. Those aren't your words, Elizabeth. Those are theirs. And I'll not stand here and let you say them in my own hall as though they were true. They are true. They are not." He stopped an arm's length from her. "You want to know what's true? I'll tell you what's true. 4 days back I watched you pull a dying child back into this world with onions and steam and stubbornness when a man with a medical degree had already given her up. That's true. I watched you scold Eli Renner over a poisoned hand he was too proud to mention. That's true. I've watched a line of frightened folk form outside my kitchen every morning for a fortnight, folk who've learned there's finally somebody in this county who'll help them and never make them feel small for needing it. That's true, Elizabeth. That's what you are." His voice roughened. "Silas Aldridge came into my house today and offered me his daughter and half his land and everything my father ever wanted for me. And I turned it down. You know why?" She couldn't speak. "Because for 7 years I have been a man waiting for the right carriage," Nathaniel said. "And a fortnight ago, a soaked, shoeless, frightened woman fell into the wrong one, and she was the first person in the whole of my life to want nothing from me but to hear me laugh again." His jaw worked. "I'll not trade that. Not for the Aldridge land. Not for my good name. Not for anything Silas Aldridge or the whole of that town can threaten me with. So if they want to make a story of us, Elizabeth, then let them. Let them make their story. I'd sooner be the ruined fool who chose the finest woman in 3 counties than the respected man who let her walk home in the rain to keep his reputation clean." The hall was silent. And Elizabeth Carter, who had run out into a storm 2 weeks before to disappear, stood in a great warm house and understood that she had, against everything she knew about the world, failed entirely to disappear. "You don't know what you're choosing," she whispered. "I know exactly what I'm choosing. They'll come for you, both of us. You know they will. Then they'll come." He said it simple, like it was already decided, like it had been decided the night he answered the right one actually into the dark of a carriage. "Let them come, Elizabeth. I've spent 7 years with nothing worth defending. I find I'm almost glad of the chance." And somewhere out past the gates of Harrowdene, on the road back to town, Silas Aldridge sat in his fine carriage beside his furious daughter and turned a cold and patient plan over in his mind. A plan that would use every scrap of that filthy story, every whisper and every wager, and every soul in that town who'd ever called the Carter girl a nobody. And Cordelia Aldridge stared out at the passing fields with murder in her lovely eyes and said low, "I want her gone, Father. Whatever it takes. I want that woman gone. And Silas Aldrich patted his daughter's gloved hand and smiled and said, "She will be my dear. Trust your father. By summer's end, there won't be a door in this county open to Elizabeth Carter." He looked back once through the carriage window at the great house of Harrow shrinking behind them in the gold evening light. And when the whole town's turned against her when she's got nowhere left to run, we'll see how long Nathaniel Harrow's fine principles last against the ruin of everything his father built. The carriage rolled on toward town, and back at Harrowdean, unknowing Elizabeth Carter looked up into the face of the man who had chosen her and let herself for one moment, just one, believe that she might get to keep a good thing after all. She would remember that moment. She would need to. The reckoning did not come all at once. That was the cruelty of Silas Aldrich's method, and Elizabeth would understand it only slowly, the way you understand a slow poison, not by any single blow, but by the accumulating weight of 100 small ones. It began quiet. It began the way these things always begin, with a word said in the right ear at the right time, and then another, and then 100, until a lie had grown so many legs that nobody could remember it had ever needed the first one. The first she knew of it was Sarah Renner come up to the kitchen on a Thursday with her eyes red and her mouth set hard. "Miss Carter," Sarah said, "I got to tell you a thing and I don't want to, and I'm going to anyhow because you've been good to my Mercy and you deserve to hear it straight from a friend before you hear it crooked from a stranger." Elizabeth set down her pestle. "What is it?" "They're saying things, in town." Sarah twisted her apron in her hands. "My cousin's married to a man does hauling for the mercantile, and he heard it plain from more'n one mouth. They're saying—" She stopped, started again. "They're saying you've bewitched Mr. Harrow, that you come to him in a storm like something out of a story, and now you've got him so turned around, he's throwing over the Aldrich girl and shaming his own dead wife's memory. They're saying—" Her voice dropped. "They're saying you're no doctor at all, that the doctoring's a cover, that a decent woman doesn't go touching men's hands and sitting up nights in their cabins, and what kind of a woman—" "Stop." Elizabeth's voice came out very quiet. "I understand. You needn't say the rest. I know the rest. It ain't true, not a word of it. Every soul on this ranch knows what you done for us. Every soul on this ranch." "Yes." Elizabeth's hands had gone still on the table. "And how many souls is that Sarah said against a whole town? How many of us against all of them?" Sarah had no answer for that. There wasn't one. Elizabeth turned back to her work, but her hands were not steady now, and she knew with the old familiar, sickening certainty of a woman who has watched a thing get taken from her before that it had begun. The thing she'd feared in the hall 2 weeks past. The story. And there was not one thing she could do to stop it, because you cannot fight a whisper. A whisper has no face to strike at. A whisper is everywhere and nowhere, and by the time you've heard it, it has already done its work. She did not tell Nathaniel. She told herself it was to spare him, and that was half the truth. The other half, the half she was ashamed of, was that some old whipped part of her had already begun to believe it was only right. Only what she'd earned. A woman like her reaching for a thing like this. Of course it would be taken. Of course there would be a price. There was always a price. But Nathaniel found out anyway, because a man like Nathaniel Harrow had ears in town whether he wanted them or not, and by Saturday he came in from a ride with his face like a thundercloud, and found her in the kitchen and said without preamble, "How long have you known—" "Known what?" "Don't." His voice was rough. "Don't do that. Don't make small the thing they're doing to you. How long, Elizabeth?" She looked at him a long moment. Then she set down her work. 2 days, she said. Sarah told me Thursday. 2 days, you've known they're dragging your name through the filth of that town and you said nothing to me. What would I have said? She spread her hands. What could you have done, Nathaniel, but exactly the thing you did in that hall, put your own name up beside mine and give them a bigger target to aim at. You can't fight a rumor, you'll only feed it. The more you defend me, the more it looks like there's a thing to defend, and the story grows and— Her voice cracked. I told you 2 weeks ago this would happen. I told you I'd be the thing that brought you low and you wouldn't hear it, and now nothing. He crossed to her. Now we hold. That's all. We do nothing wrong because we've done nothing wrong, and we let them tire themselves out throwing stones at a thing that isn't there. That isn't how it works. You've never been the one they threw the stones at, so you don't know. It doesn't matter that there's nothing there. They don't need there to be anything there. They only need to keep throwing. She turned away from him. I should go. I should have gone the day the Aldridges came. Every day I stay, it gets worse for you, and if you say one more word about leaving, Nathaniel said low, I'll... He stopped, breathed. When he spoke again, it was quieter. Elizabeth, please, don't ask me to be relieved when you talk of walking out of my life to keep me comfortable. There's no comfort in it. There's no comfort in a version of my days that doesn't have you in it. Do you understand me? However bad they make it, and I'll not pretend they can't make it bad. It will not be worse than the 7 years I spent in this house before you fell into that carriage. So don't offer me that. It's no mercy. And Elizabeth, who had every reason in the world to run and every intention of doing it, stayed. She stayed, and it got worse exactly as she'd known it would. It got worse in ways she hadn't reckoned on because Silas Aldridge was a more patient and more thorough man than she'd given him credit for. He did not merely spread a story. He built a siege. The first hard blow came at the Mercantile when Eli Renner rode into town for supplies, as he'd done 100 times, and Amos Pike, who kept the store, who'd known Eli 11 years, set his purchases on the counter and then would not meet his eye. Said the account was closed. Harrow's credit was no good at the Mercantile any longer. Cash only. And when Eli, stunned, asked why, Amos Pike looked at the floor and mumbled something about the tone a man keeps at his ranch and the sort of company and a respectable establishment can't be seen to, and Eli understood and went white with fury, and near came across the counter before he mastered himself. Because it wasn't about credit. Silas Aldridge held paper on half the businesses in that town, notes and loans and favors going back 20 years, and he had begun quietly to call them in, or to threaten to, against any man who did business with Harrow. It cost Silas nothing. It cost the town everything to defy him. And so, one shop front at a time, the doors began to close. He's freezing you out, Elizabeth said when Eli brought the news back. She'd gone very still. That's what he's doing. He can't strike at you direct, so he's strangling the ranch, turning the whole town into his weapon. Let him try. Nathaniel's voice was iron. I've cash enough to buy this ranch's supplies 3 counties over if I have to. He can close every door in that town. I'll not starve for it. It's not about the supplies. Elizabeth pressed her fingers to her temples. Don't you see? It's never been about the supplies or the credit or any of it. It's about this, right now, this moment. Him making you feel it, making the whole ranch feel it. Every hand on this place is going to know by supper that Harrow's been cut off from the town, and they're going to know why. They're going to know it's because of me. Her voice dropped. How long before they start to resent it, Nathaniel? How long before the men who've stood by me start to wonder if their families are going hungry over a woman who fell into your carriage in the rain? That will not happen. You don't know that. I know my men. But Elizabeth had lived a whole life on the losing side of these arithmetic, and she knew a thing Nathaniel, in all his certainty, did not. That loyalty is a beautiful thing and a real thing, but it is not a thing you can eat, and that even the best of men will choose their children's supper over a stranger's good name if you make the price high enough. And Silas Aldridge was a man who understood exactly how to make the price high enough. The second blow was worse, and it came for her directly. It came on a Sunday, and it came through the one door Elizabeth had not thought to guard, because it was the one door she had believed sacred. She had not been to church since she came to Harrow. She'd told herself it was the distance, the work, the line of folk that formed each morning. But the truth was, she'd been afraid of exactly the thing that was coming. And when Mrs. Doyle said gentle that maybe it'd do her good to go to show her face plain and unashamed before God and the county, both to prove she had nothing to hide, Elizabeth had let herself be persuaded. Because Mrs. Doyle was right. She had nothing to hide. And a woman with nothing to hide ought to be able to walk into a house of God on a Sunday morning. Nathaniel drove her himself. In the carriage. In broad daylight. "You're certain?" she said on the road in. "I'm certain." His hands were easy on the reins. "Let them see us come in the front door of God's own house with our heads up. It's the truest answer there is to a whispered lie. Let them look." They looked. The whole congregation turned when the two of them came through the doors, and the murmur that ran through the pews was a physical thing, a wave of it, and Elizabeth felt every eye on her like a brand. But she kept her chin level, the way she'd learned to on the worst night of her life, and she walked in on Nathaniel Harrow's arm, and they took a pew near the back, and for one moment, one fragile moment, she thought perhaps it would hold. Perhaps the simple sight of them decent and quiet in a house of worship would be enough. It was Reverend Coy who broke it. He was a thin, dry man, with a thin, dry voice, and Elizabeth had never met him, and she understood the moment he mounted the pulpit and let his gaze settle on their pew that Silas Aldridge held paper on the Reverend's soul, same as everybody else's. Because the sermon he preached that morning was not the sermon printed in his book. It was a sermon about temptation, about the serpent in the garden and the ruin of good men through the wiles of women, about how the devil rarely comes with horns and a tail. Brothers and sisters, know the devil comes as something soft and needful, and pitiable comes as a stranger in the rain comes asking only for shelter, and takes in the end a man's very soul. He did not say her name. He did not have to. Every eye in that church knew exactly whose ruin he was preaching. Elizabeth sat with her spine straight, and her hands folded, and her face like carved stone, while a man of God stood in his pulpit and called her the devil to her face before the whole assembled county. And beside her, she felt Nathaniel go rigid, felt the fury come off him like heat off a stove, felt him begin to gather himself to rise, and she put her hand over his quick and pressed down hard and whispered, "No, don't, not here. You cannot win an argument with a preacher in his own church. You'll only prove him right. He is calling you." "I know what he's calling me." Her voice was a thread. "Sit still, please, for me. If you love me at all, Nathaniel, sit still." It was the first time either of them had said the word. It landed between them in that terrible church in the middle of that terrible sermon, and Nathaniel Harrow turned his head and looked at her. Really looked. And slowly, the fury in him banked down to something else, something that had tears in the back of it, and he turned his hand over beneath hers so their palms met, and he laced his fingers through hers, and he sat still. He sat still, and he held her hand in the sight of God and the whole county all through the rest of a sermon that damned her. And that small, quiet, unyielding thing was the answer that Reverend Coy's poison could not survive, because the congregation had come to see the serpent. And what they saw instead was a proud man holding a frightened woman's hand through her own public shaming and refusing to be ashamed of it. Some of them looked away. Some of them, Elizabeth saw, had the grace to flush. And a few, a precious few, looked at the two of them with something that was not judgment at all, but the dawning, uncomfortable beginnings of doubt. It was not victory. It was a long way from victory, but it was the first crack in the wall. They walked out of that church with their hands still joined and the whole assembly parting before them, and not one soul brave enough to say aloud to their faces the thing the preacher had said from the safety of his pulpit. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen a person do," Nathaniel said on the road home, and his voice was not steady. "I did nothing. I only sat there. You sat there and let a man call you the devil, and you did not give him the satisfaction of one tear or one word. There are generals couldn't have held that line." He shook his head. "Elizabeth, I have never in my life met your like, and I have met, I promise you, a great many people who thought a great deal more of themselves." She almost smiled. Almost. But there was a cold thing sitting in her chest that would not warm because she had seen something in that church that Nathaniel in his fury and his tenderness had missed. She had seen Cordelia Aldridge in the second pew, and Cordelia Aldridge had not looked triumphant watching the sermon do its work. She had looked for one unguarded instant disappointed, the disappointment of a hunter who has fired and sees the shot go wide, watching that proud joint-handed exit, watching the crack open in the wall her father's poison had built. And Elizabeth had understood with a lurch of pure dread that a hunter who sees her first shot miss does not go home. She reloads. The last blow, the one Silas had been building toward the whole time, the one all the rest had only been prelude to, came 10 days later, and it did not come as a whisper. It came as a summons. A rider came up the drive at Harrowdean on a hot, bright morning with a paper in his hand and an official seal on it, and Elizabeth was in the yard when he came, and she watched Nathaniel take the paper and read it, and she watched his face change, and she knew before he said a word that the thing they'd been dreading had finally come. "What is it?" she said. "Nathaniel, what is it?" He didn't answer at first. He read it again as though the second reading might change the words. "It's a hearing," he said finally. "Before the county magistrate, 3 days hence." His jaw was tight. "Silas has brought a petition." "A petition of what?" Nathaniel looked at her, and there was something in his eyes she'd never seen there before. Not fury, not tenderness, but something colder and more frightened, the look of a man who has just seen the true shape of the trap and understood too late how neatly it was laid. "He's petitioned the court," Nathaniel said slowly, "to have you declared a vagrant. A woman of no fixed home, no husband, no visible lawful means, and no good character. His words practicing medicine without license or training on the persons of this county. And to have you removed, run out of the county entire under color of law." His hand crushed the paper. "It's dressed up in a dozen legal words, but that's the meat of it. He's going to use the court itself to drive you out, and he's stacked it. Elizabeth, the county magistrate, is Harlan Pruitt. Silas holds his notes. Silas has held them for years." The yard seemed to tilt under Elizabeth's feet, because she understood all at once the full and terrible genius of it. Silas had not needed to prove the filthy story. He had never needed to. He'd only needed the story to exist long enough to make a legal fiction plausible, a woman of no good character, and then he'd take her not with a mob or a scandal, but with the cold, clean machinery of the law itself in a courtroom before a judge he owned, where Nathaniel's money, and Nathaniel's name, and even Nathaniel's love could not reach her. You cannot punch a courtroom. You cannot outshout a magistrate. Every weapon Nathaniel had was useless in that one arena, and Silas had known it and had spent a month herding them both toward it. "Pruitt," Elizabeth said faintly. "The magistrate, Harlan Pruitt. You know the name." "I know the name." She put her hand to her mouth. "Mrs. Pruitt, old Mrs. Pruitt with the fevers, the one I nursed back before she's Harlan Pruitt's mother." Nathaniel went very still. "His mother," he said slowly. "Elizabeth, are you telling me the magistrate's own mother is a woman you doctored for 2 winters, when the town physician wouldn't ride out to her because the money was thin? I brought her through the ague twice." Elizabeth's mind was racing now. "But Nathaniel, that cuts both ways. It cuts both ways. If he's in Silas's pocket, then knowing I saved his mother might make it worse. Not better he can't be seen to favor me. He'd have to lean harder the other way to prove he's not bought." "Or," Nathaniel said, and there was a light coming up in his eyes. Now, a hard, bright, dangerous light. "It means there's one man in that courtroom who knows in his own heart exactly what kind of woman you really are. Whatever paper Silas holds on him. A man can owe money and still owe his mother's life. Those are different debts, Elizabeth, and they don't always pull the same direction." They had 3 days. Nathaniel wanted to fight it head-on, to bring in a lawyer from the city to answer Silas's petition with a wall of hired legal muscle, to make it a battle of purses that he could not lose. And Elizabeth, who had spent that first night pacing the blue room till dawn, stopped him. "No," she said over breakfast, and there was a plan in her voice now hard and clear. "That's exactly what he wants. If you fight it with lawyers and money, then it becomes a fight about lawyers and money, rich man against rich man, and the whole town watching 2 wealthy men squabble over a woman like she's a parcel of land. And I'm the parcel. I disappear again. I become the thing you're fighting over instead of a person at all." She shook her head. "I've spent my whole life being talked about instead of talked to. I'll not walk into that courtroom and let it happen one more time. Then what, Elizabeth? In 3 days that court will— I know what the court will do." She looked at him steady. "So we don't fight the court, Nathaniel. We fill it." "Fill it." Silas built his whole case on one lie, that I'm a woman of no good character. No home, no worth, no standing. A vagrant, a nobody in the rain. Her voice had gone quiet and fierce. "So we prove him wrong the only way a lie like that can ever be proved wrong. Not with lawyers, with witnesses, with every soul in this county I've laid a hand on and helped." She began to count them off, and her voice caught as she did, because she had never once in all her life thought of herself as a woman with people. Sarah and Eli Renner, whose mercy I pulled out of the fever. The Bergen boy whose leg I set straight. The Callahan child that came crossways and lived. Old Mrs. Pruitt, the magistrate's own mother that I brought through the ague twice. The dozens of hands on this ranch and their wives and their children who've stood in your kitchen these 2 months and been helped and never once made small. She looked up at him. "Silas Aldridge wants to stand up in that courtroom and say I'm a woman of no good character. So let him say it. And then let him look at the room. And let him try to say it to the faces of every person in this county whose life I've touched." Nathaniel Harrow looked at her across the table, and something moved in his face that she would remember the rest of her days. "You," he said slowly, "are not going to defend yourself at all, are you? No. You're going to let them defend you. I'm going to let the truth defend me. The truth's got 100 faces in this county, Nathaniel. Silas has got one lie. I'll take those odds." Her voice dropped. "And there's one more thing. The most important thing. When I stand up in that court, because they'll make me stand, they'll make me answer, I'm not going to beg. I'm not going to weep and plead and ask them to have mercy on a poor ragged woman. That's what he expects. That's what breaks a woman like me in a room like that being made to grovel for the right to exist." Her chin came up. "I'm going to stand up in that courtroom, and I'm going to tell them exactly who I am and exactly what I've done, plain and unashamed. And I'm going to let them decide whether that's a woman of no good character. And if they run me out of this county anyway—" Her voice shook, but held. "Then I'll walk out the front door of it with my head up the same as I walked out of that party in the rain. Because I will not, Nathaniel, I will not let Silas Aldridge or that magistrate or the whole of that town make me small ever again. I'm done being made small. Whatever else happens Thursday, that part is finished. Me. There was a silence in the kitchen, and then Mrs. Doyle, who had been standing at the stove, pretending very hard not to listen, set down her spoon and turned around with tears streaming plain down her weathered face, and said in a voice thick with them, "Well, I'll be riding to town myself Thursday then, and I'll be bringing every soul on this place that can sit a wagon. Let that Aldridge devil look at that." Time. Thursday came hot and bright and merciless. The county courthouse was a plain brick building on the town square, and it had never in its history held a crowd like the one that came to it that morning. Because word had gone out, Silas Aldridge had made sure of it wanting an audience for the ruin of the Carter woman, and the town had turned out in force, filling the benches lining the walls hungry for the spectacle. The respectable folk, the whisperers, the men who'd made the wager, and the women who'd repeated the story. Reverend Coy in the front row. Cordelia Aldridge in silk seated beside her father like a queen come to watch an execution. And then the wagons came. They came from Harrowdean in a line down the town road, one after another, and the town watched them come, and the whispering died. Because it was not just Nathaniel Harrow and his household. It was Eli Renner, with little Mercy, dressed in her Sunday best, sitting up straight and healthy on his knee. It was Sarah Renner. It was the Bergen family, and the boy whose leg Elizabeth had set walking on it plain and strong for the whole town to see. It was the Callahans with their crossways child alive and squalling in her mother's arms. It was every hand on Harrowdean Ranch, and every wife and every child, dozens of them filing into that courtroom in their Sunday clothes, and taking up every seat and every foot of standing room that the town's own gossips hadn't already claimed, until the two crowds pressed up against each other in that hot brick room, the whisperers who'd come to see the Carter woman destroyed, and the people whose lives she'd saved come to stand for her. And in the very last wagon, helped down gentle by two of the ranch women, came a tiny, ancient, iron-spined old woman that a good portion of the town had believed to be dead these 2 years old. Mrs. Pruitt herself, the magistrate's mother, who had not been seen in public since the fevers, and who had insisted when word reached her of what her son's court meant to do on being brought in to see it with her own eyes. Elizabeth watched them all come in, and she could not breathe for the weight of it, because she had spent her whole life believing she was a woman with nobody. The coat rack, the nobody in the rain. And here was a courthouse filling row on row with the faces of a life she hadn't known she'd built, the sick she'd healed, and the frightened she'd calmed, and the children she'd pulled back from the dark. All of them come on a working Thursday to stand in a hot room and be counted on her side. "You see," Nathaniel murmured beside her. His voice was rough. "You see now, Elizabeth. You were never the nobody. You only ever believed their arithmetic instead of your own." She couldn't answer. She didn't trust herself to. Then the magistrate came in, and the room rose, and it began. It began badly. Harlan Pruitt was a heavy, cautious, unhappy-looking man, and Elizabeth saw at once the trap he was caught in, the notes Silas held over him on one side, and on the other filing into his courtroom the living proof of what the woman before him truly was, and his own mother among them. He would not meet Elizabeth's eye. He would not meet his mother's. He shuffled Silas's petition on the bench before him and cleared his throat too many times, and when he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man reading words he wished were not his to read. Silas's lawyer laid out the petition, and it was every bit as ugly as Nathaniel had warned. A woman of no fixed abode, no husband, no property, no lawful standing. Practicing medicine if it could be dignified with the word, the lawyer sneered, without license or training, endangering the good folk of the county. A woman, in short, of no good character, whose presence was a corruption, and whose removal the peace of the county plainly required. The lawyer spoke well and long, and he never once said the filthy thing directly, and the whole room heard it anyway in every pause and every curl of his lip. And then Silas Aldridge himself rose to speak, because he could not help it, because he wanted the pleasure of it. He rose in his fine coat, and he turned so the whole room could hear him, and he said, "Your Honor, I'll not belabor what every decent soul in this county already knows. This woman came from nowhere. She has bewitched a good man, and shamed his dead wife's memory, and made a mockery of the morals of this county. She is a woman of no name, no home, and no good character whatsoever, and that's a lie." The voice cut across the courtroom like a whip, and it took Silas a full second to understand it had come from Elizabeth, that she had risen unbidden, unasked before the magistrate had called on her, and was standing straight-backed in the middle of that hot, crowded room, with her chin level and her eyes dry and blazing. "Order," Pruitt said weakly. The accused will—" "I'm not accused of anything, Your Honor. That's the whole trouble." Elizabeth's voice rang clear. "There's no crime named in that petition. There's no theft, no violence, no thing I've done to a living soul but help them. There's only 3 words doing all the work in that man's petition, and they are no good character, and I have stood here and listened to Silas Aldridge say them 4 times now, and I will not sit down and let him say them a 5th without answering. So run me out if you mean to, but you'll do it having heard me. That much the law owes even a nobody in the rain." The room had gone dead silent. Harlan Pruitt looked at her, and then helplessly, unwillingly, he looked at the crowd, at the rows of Harrowdine faces, at his own mother's iron eyes fixed on him from the 3rd row, and something in him seemed to give way, some small last scrap of the man he'd been before Silas Aldridge owned his paper. "The court," he said heavily, "will hear the woman." And Elizabeth Carter told them who she was. She did not weep. She did not beg. She stood in the middle of that hostile room, and she told them plain and unadorned in a voice that never once shook. She told them about her father, and the farm, and the debts. She told them about the years of being invisible, of standing in corners, of being the coat rack they laughed at in fine, warm rooms. She did not spare herself, and she did not exaggerate. And then she began to name what she had done. Silas Aldridge says I practice medicine without training. That's near true. I've no diploma. My mother trained me before the fever took her, and I've trained myself on every soul that had nowhere else to turn since. So I'll not stand here and claim a schooling I never had. Her voice hardened. But I'll ask this courtroom a question. 2 winters back, when old Mrs. Pruitt lay dying of the ague, and the town physician wouldn't ride out to her because the money was thin, who came? When the fever took Mercy, Renner 4 days deep, and the same physician looked at a dying child and said, "Keep her comfortable," and took his fee and rode home. Who got down on her knees in that cabin and pulled her back? When the Bergen boy's leg broke crooked 2 days' ride from any doctor, and would have left him a cripple, who set it straight? She turned slowly, taking in the whole room. I did. Not for money, I never took a coin. I wasn't freely given, and most gave none, and I asked for none. I did it because somebody had to, and everybody who could have decided it wasn't theirs to have to. And Silas Aldridge stands here and calls that no good character. Her voice dropped to something quiet and terrible. Then I don't know what character is, and neither I think does he. And that was when old Mrs. Pruitt stood up. She stood in the 3rd row, all 4 foot something of her, and she planted her cane, and she said in a voice like dry sticks, breaking loud enough to fill the whole room, "Harlan Pruitt, you look at me. Mother, you look at your mother, boy. I carried you, and I raised you, and I'll speak in this courtroom if I please, and you'll not gavel me quiet." The old woman's eyes were fierce. That girl there saved my life, twice. When I was dying and forgot by everybody in this town, including... Her voice cracked like a whip. Including my own son, who was too busy with his notes and his ledgers to ride out and see if his mother was breathing. She came. A stranger. And she sat up 2 nights running with a dying old woman that could do nothing for her and asked nothing and took nothing, and I am standing here today because of it. She turned her fierce old gaze on the whole room. And now you people want to run her out of this county for a woman of no good character. You ought to be ashamed. Every last mother's son of you. There's not a Christian soul in this room fit to wipe that girl's boots, and you all know it, and you came here to watch her destroyed anyhow, because a rich man told you to. She sat back down hard. Well, I'll not watch it, and neither if he's got 1 scrap of the raising I gave him will my son. The courtroom erupted, and Harlan Pruitt sat on his bench with his mother's words ringing in the rafters, and his mother's eyes fixed on him, and a whole county's worth of witnesses in front of him. And Elizabeth saw the exact moment the man chose, saw him look down at Silas's petition, and then at the notes, and the debts, and the whole cold machinery Silas had built to own him, and then at last up at his mother's face and set it all down. But Silas Aldridge was not finished. Because a man like Silas always has one more card, and he played it now, rising red-faced and furious over the din, stabbing a finger toward Elizabeth. Sentiment. Sentiment and play-acting. It changes nothing. The woman herself admits she has no training, no license, no standing. She's a vagrant by her own mouth. And I'll remind this court and this county that whatever tricks she's worked on, the sick and the simple, there remains the matter of her conduct, the matter of a decent man's home turned to a... Say it. Nathaniel Harrow was on his feet. He had been silent the whole time. He had let Elizabeth stand her own ground because he'd understood that it was hers to stand and that stepping in front of her would only prove Silas's story. But now he rose and his voice filled the courtroom like a door slamming, and Silas's words died in his throat. Say it, Silas, out loud, in front of all these people and God's own daylight. Say the thing you've spent a month whispering behind your hand. Say what you mean about her conduct and my home. He came forward slow, and there was nothing cold in his face now, nothing of the mask, only a terrible open fury. Because I have stood by for a month and watched you strangle my ranch and poison my church and drag through the filth the name of the finest woman this county has ever been blessed with, and too blind to see it. And I've held my peace because she asked me to, because she's wiser than I am, and she knew that answering a whisper only feeds it. But you're not whispering now, Silas. You're standing in a courtroom. So say it to my face. Say what you're accusing that woman of, and let's you and I have it out in the open at last." The courtroom held its breath. And Silas Aldridge, who was, when all was said, a bully, and bullies do their bravest work in the dark, looked at the fury in Nathaniel Harrow's face, and at the rows of witnesses, and at his own bought magistrate sitting frozen and useless on the bench, and could not say it. He opened his mouth, and nothing came. "No," Nathaniel said softly into the silence. "I didn't think you could, because there's nothing to say, Silas. There never was. You built a whole siege on a thing you can't even speak aloud in the light, and now here it is in the light, and it's nothing, and everyone in this room can see it's nothing." He turned to face the magistrate, and the whole crowd with him. "Elizabeth Carter came to my ranch by accident on the worst night of her life, and she has healed everyone she's touched and harmed no one, and asked for nothing. And I will tell you all the plain truth of it now, since we're all done pretending I love her. I love her, and I mean to ask her to be my wife the moment this court has stopped trying to run her out of the county, and if that's a scandal, then every one of you can choke on it." He looked back at Silas one last time, and his voice went quiet. "You wanted to make her small, Silas. You've done the opposite. You've filled a courthouse with the proof of exactly how large she is. I ought to thank you. I don't believe I'd have found the courage to say all this myself if you hadn't tried so hard to take her from me." And in the ringing silence that followed, Harlan Pruitt brought down his gavel and dismissed Silas Aldridge's petition, and the courthouse came apart in an uproar that could be heard clear across the town square. It should have been the end of it. Elizabeth stood in the chaos of that courtroom, the Harrow families surging up around her, Sarah Renner weeping, and little Mercy's arms locked round her neck. Old Mrs. Pruitt banging her cane in triumph, and Nathaniel's hand finding hers through the crush, and for one shining moment she let herself believe it was over, that the wall was down, that she had walked into the fire and come out the other side with a whole life she hadn't known was hers, and a man who had just said before God and the county that he loved her. She was looking up into his face, and he was looking down into hers, and the words he'd said were still ringing in her ears. "I mean to ask her to be my wife," and she had just opened her mouth to answer him, right there in the middle of everything, when she saw his eyes shift past her shoulder toward the courtroom doors. She saw his face change. She turned. Silas Aldridge was gone from his seat, had slipped out in the uproar. Beaten, humiliated, run off. But Cordelia Aldridge had not gone. Cordelia stood alone by the courtroom doors in her fine silk, and she was not weeping, and she was not raging, and that was the thing that stopped Elizabeth's blood cold. She wore instead a small and perfect and patient smile, the smile of a woman who has lost a battle and knows a thing about the war that no one else in the room does yet. And as the crowd swirled between them, Cordelia Aldridge caught Elizabeth's eye across the whole length of that courtroom, and she lifted one gloved hand, and she touched a folded paper tucked into her bodice, tapped it twice, deliberate, so that Elizabeth would see and understand that it was there. And she mouthed, silent and sweet, 3 words that Elizabeth read plain across the roaring room. "I know everything." And then she turned, and she was gone through the doors into the bright, hot day, and Elizabeth Carter stood in the wreckage of her own victory, with Nathaniel's hand in hers, and a cold new dread opening like a pit beneath the joy. Because whatever it was that Cordelia Aldridge believed she knew whatever was folded in that paper against her heart, the woman had not looked beaten at all. She had looked like a woman who'd been saving her real shot for last. The 3 words hung in Elizabeth's mind for the whole ride back to Harrowdean, and she said nothing of them. She told herself there was nothing to tell. A woman in silk had touched a paper and mouthed a threat and vanished, that was all. It could mean anything. It could mean nothing. Cordelia Aldridge was a beaten woman grasping at the last shred of a bluff, and Elizabeth had won. Hadn't she won cleanly, and before the whole county? and she was riding home beside a man who had stood up in open court and said he loved her. She would not let Cordelia Aldridge steal 1 hour of that. She would not. But she had spent her whole life reading the faces of powerful people to know when a blow was coming, and Cordelia's face had not been the face of a bluff. It had been the face of a woman holding a winning hand and choosing the moment to lay it down. "You've gone quiet," Nathaniel said on the road. "You've not said a word since the courthouse." "I'm tired, that's all." Elizabeth. "I'm tired, Nathaniel." She made herself smile at him. A body's allowed to be tired the day she wins a war. He let it go. But he watched her a moment longer than the answer warranted, and she knew he wasn't fooled, and she was grateful he loved her enough not to press, because she did not yet know what Cordelia knew, and until she knew she could not decide what it was safe to say. So she carried it alone the way she'd carried everything alone her whole life, the old habit reaching up through all the new happiness, to remind her that she had never once not truly let herself believe a good thing would be allowed to last. They came up the drive to Harrowdean in the long gold evening, and the whole ranch was waiting for them, and it should have been the sweetest homecoming of her life. Mrs. Doyle had cooked as though for a wedding. Eli Renner had broached a barrel. There was fiddle music before the sun was fully down and dancing in the yard, and little Mercy Renner would not be pried from Elizabeth's skirts, and every hand on the place came up in their turn to shake her hand or duck their head shy and say some rough version of, "We're glad you stayed, ma'am. We're mighty glad." And Nathaniel found her late when the fiddle had gone soft and the dancing had gone slow and the first stars were out over the yard, and he took her 2 hands in his. And he did not go down on one knee, because that was not his way, but he stood before her plain and steady, and said the thing he'd promised the courtroom he would say. "I meant it," he said. "Every word of it in that courtroom. I'll say it again now, just to you, just for us, so it's not a thing shouted at a magistrate, but a thing given to you." His hands tightened on hers. "I love you, Elizabeth Carter. I have loved you, I think, since you fell into my carriage and tried to give me back my own handkerchief. I've spent 7 years in a house I hated being a name and a fortune and a thing to be traded, and you are the first soul in the whole of my life who ever looked past all of it and saw the man." His voice roughened. "Marry me, not to save you, not to spite Silas, not for any reason on this earth but that I cannot imagine one more day of my life that doesn't have you in it. Marry me, Elizabeth, please." And Elizabeth Carter, who had run out into a storm 2 months before to disappear, stood in a yard full of fiddle music and firelight, and the faces of a life she'd never known she had, and looked up into the face of the man who had chosen her over everything he owned, and could not for one long terrible moment make herself say yes, because Cordelia's 3 words were still there. "I know everything." And Elizabeth understood with a clarity that near broke her heart that she could not marry this man, could not bind her ruin to his until she knew what it was that Cordelia held. Because if there was a thing coming, a thing that could still take everything from him, then saying yes tonight was not love. It was letting him sign a paper he hadn't read. And she had spent her whole life on the wrong side of papers people signed without reading. She would not do it to him. "Nathaniel," she said, and her voice shook. "I love you. God help me. I love you so much I can hardly stand up under it. And I want to say yes, I want it more than I've wanted anything in my whole life." "Then say it." "I can't. Not tonight." She saw the hurt bloom in his face and rushed on. "It's not a no. I swear to you before God, it's not a no. It's only there's a thing I have to be sure of first. A thing I have to settle. And I can't tell you what it is yet, because I don't rightly know myself. But I need Nathaniel. I need 3 days, just 3 days. And then I'll give you my answer, and I promise, it'll be the answer we both want. Only let me be sure first that I'm giving you a whole thing, and not a thing with a rod in it you can't see." Tears stood in her eyes. "You gave me 3 days once before to fight in a courtroom. Give me 3 more. Please." And Nathaniel Harrow, who did not understand and was plainly wounded and could see she was frightened of something she wouldn't name, looked into her face a long moment, and then because he loved her, and because trusting her was the whole of what love had come to mean to him, He let go of one of her hands and pressed the other to his mouth. 3 days, he said quietly. You'll have your 3 days, Elizabeth. But know this. Whatever it is you're afraid of, whatever you think you've got to settle alone, you're wrong that it can change my answer. There's nothing on this earth you could tell me that would. I only wish you'd let me carry it with you. You will, she whispered. Soon. I promise. Just not yet. Boy, she did not have to wait 3 days. Cordelia Aldridge came to her the very next afternoon, and she came alone, and she came clever. She came when Nathaniel was out on the far range, when Elizabeth was in her kitchen corner with the door open to the yard, so that the whole thing would happen quiet and private and leave no witness but the two of them. Elizabeth looked up from her herbs, and Cordelia was simply there in the doorway, silk and gold, and that same patient, terrible smile. So, Cordelia said, the doctoring woman, in her little kitchen with her little jars. How very cozy. She stepped inside, uninvited, drawing off her gloves finger by finger. I'll not take much of your time. I know you're a busy woman. All these fevers to break. All these bones to set. Such important work. Say what you came to say, Miss Aldridge. Elizabeth kept her voice level, though her heart had begun to pound. You came a long way to gloat over a court you lost. I don't imagine that's it. No. Cordelia's smile widened. No, that's not it. She drew the folded paper from her bodice, the same paper she'd tapped in the courtroom, and she held it up between 2 fingers and let Elizabeth look at it. You've been so brave these last months, so very brave, and so very good, and so very wronged. The poor doctoring woman the wicked town turned against. Everyone loves that story. I very nearly love it myself. Her eyes glittered. There's only one small trouble with it, Elizabeth. May I call you Elizabeth? We're going to be so intimate, you and I. The trouble is, it isn't your real name, is it? Elizabeth went very still. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do. Cordelia unfolded the paper, slow, savoring it. You see, when my father's whispers weren't quite doing the work, I got impatient. I hired a man, a very thorough man, the kind who asks questions in the towns a person came from, not just the town they landed in. And do you know what my thorough man found when he went digging into the history of Elizabeth Carter, poor orphaned daughter of a poor, honest farmer? She looked up, and every scrap of the pretty softness was gone from her face now. He found there's no Elizabeth Carter, not born where you say, not to the parents you name. Your whole history, from the farm to the debts to the dead mother who taught you your doctoring, every word of it is a story you built. Isn't it, Elizabeth? Because whoever you were before you came to this county, you weren't her. The kitchen was very quiet, and Elizabeth Carter, or the woman the county called by that name, set down the herbs in her hand very carefully and did not deny it. How much, she said in a voice gone flat and old, does he know your thorough man? Cordelia's smile came back triumphant now, because the lack of denial was all the confirmation she'd needed. Not everything, she admitted. Not yet. He knows the name's false and the history's built. He knows you came into this county 3 years back with nothing and no past that holds up to a hard look. He hasn't yet found who you really are or what you were running from when you got here, but he will, Elizabeth. He's very thorough, and my father has very deep pockets, and it's only a matter of time. She folded the paper and tucked it away. So here's my offer, and it's the only one I'll make, so listen close. You leave, tonight. You pack your little jars, and you go quiet, and you never come back. And you never tell Nathaniel Harrow why you leave him a note that breaks his heart. Clean some pretty lie about how you were never worthy of him. He'll believe it. The poor besotted fool, half of him believes it already, because you've spent months telling him so. Her eyes were cold as winter. And in exchange, I bury this. The name, the false history, all of it. You disappear back into whatever hole you crawled out of, and your terrible secret dies with you. And Nathaniel never has to know that the woman he shamed himself for in open court was a liar to her very bones. And if you don't... Cordelia stepped close and dropped her voice to something soft and venomous. Then my thorough man keeps digging. And when he finds the whole of it, and he will, I won't whisper it in a church or dress it up in a magistrate's petition. I'll hand it to Nathaniel Harrow myself, every ugly page, and I'll watch his face while he reads it, and I'll watch him understand that the woman he threw over an entire fortune for, the woman he humiliated my family for, the woman he stood up in God's own courthouse and called the finest in the county, was a fraud who lied to him about her very name every single day from the first word she ever spoke to him in that carriage. She smiled. How much do you think his love survives that Elizabeth, a man who's spent 7 years being lied to and traded and used? How much does his heart survive, learning that, even his one true thing was a lie he never saw through? She stepped back. You have until tonight. I'd think fast, if I were you. And she drew her gloves back on finger by finger and walked out of Elizabeth's kitchen into the bright afternoon, leaving Elizabeth Carter standing alone among her jars, with the whole ground gone out from under 3 years of her life. Because it was true. That was the thing. That was the thing that sat in Elizabeth's chest like a stone as she stood in that kitchen with her hands shaking. Every cruel word of it was true. Elizabeth Carter was a name she had taken. The farm, the debts, the honest dead father, a history she had built careful and complete 3 years ago when she had come into this county with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a thing behind her so terrible she had buried her own true name to escape it. She had never lied about the doctoring. That was real. Her mother, her real mother, whatever the world called her, now had truly taught her. The healing was the one true thing she'd carried out of the life she'd fled, and she'd built the false one around it like a splint around a broken bone. And she had told herself for 3 years that it was a clean lie, a necessary one, that she'd harmed no one by becoming Elizabeth Carter, that the woman she'd been had needed to die, so the woman she was could live, that God surely forgave a soul for burying a name if the burying was the only way to survive what she'd survived. She had believed all that, right up until Nathaniel Harrow stood in a firelit yard and asked her to be his wife. Because you cannot marry a man under a name that isn't yours. You cannot stand before God and give a false name in a true vow. And you cannot, Elizabeth understood now, standing in the wreckage of it, you cannot love a man the way she loved Nathaniel Harrow and keep from him the single largest truth of your whole existence. She had been telling herself for weeks that the story would break them, meaning the town story, the filthy lie. But the town story had never been the danger. The danger had always been her own, the real one. The true thing folded in Cordelia's paper. Cordelia thought she'd found a weapon, and she had. But she'd misjudged badly what kind of woman she was aiming it at because she thought Elizabeth's terror was of exposure. She thought Elizabeth would run to keep the secret buried. She had it exactly backwards. Elizabeth stood in that kitchen a long time, and she wept, and then she stopped weeping. And when she had stopped, something had settled in her that felt almost like peace, the hard, clean peace of a person who has finally, after a lifetime of hiding, decided to stop. Because she was done. She was so tired of being small, and being small was the whole of what the lie had ever been, a way of making herself less than she was, so the world couldn't find her. She'd spent months learning at Harrowdean what it was to be seen, to stand in a courtroom and say plainly who she was, to let 100 faces come and be counted on her side. And now here was Cordelia Aldridge offering her the old bargain one more time: disappear. Stay small, keep the secret, and I'll let you live. And Elizabeth realized she would rather lose everything as her true self than keep it as a lie. She would tell Nathaniel, she would tell him herself, the whole of it before Cordelia's thorough man could dig out one more page. Tell him tonight, plain and unflinching, and let him decide with the whole truth in his hands what his love was worth. And if it broke him, if the 7 years lied to man could not survive one more lie, even hers even ended, then it would break, and she would walk out of Harrowdean with her head up under her own true name. And Cordelia Aldridge would have won nothing at all, because she'd have taken from Elizabeth only a thing Elizabeth had already given away freely. It was the bravest decision of her life, and she made it alone in a kitchen among her jars. She found him at dusk in the study, and she shut the door behind her, and she said, "Nathaniel, I don't need the 3 days. I have my answer to your question. But before I give it to you, there's a thing you have to know, and it's the worst thing I've ever had to say to a living soul. And I need you to let me say the whole of it before you speak. Can you do that? Can you just let me get it all out before you say anything at all?" He set down his pen. Something in her face had gone very still and very white, and he rose slow. "Elizabeth, you're frightening me." "I know. I'm sorry. I'm frightening myself." She stayed by the door as though she needed it at her back. "Cordelia Aldridge came here today, while you were on the range." His face darkened. "She what?" "Let me finish, please." She held up a hand. "She came with a paper, and she made me an offer leave tonight. Leave you a lie of a note, disappear forever, and she'd bury what she's found." "And what she's found, Nathaniel?" Her voice caught, and she forced it steady. "What she's found is that Elizabeth Carter isn't my name." The study went silent. "It isn't my name," she said again. And now that she'd begun, she found she couldn't stop the words coming faster, a thing dammed up 3 years, and finally breaking free. "There's no farm, no honest dead father with the debts. I built all of it, the whole history 3 years ago when I came into this county with nothing but the clothes on my back and a thing behind me. I was running from so hard I buried my own name to lose it. The doctoring's real. My mother taught me true. That part's God's honest truth. It's the one real thing I carried out. But everything else, everything I've ever told you about who I am and where I came from, is a story I made up, and I've been telling it to you every single day since the night I fell into your carriage, and I—" Her voice broke at last. "I'm a liar, Nathaniel. That's the thing Cordelia holds, not the filthy story the town made up, the true one. That the woman you stood up in open court for, the woman you asked to marry you last night in front of the whole ranch, doesn't even carry her own real name. And you deserve to hear it from me tonight, straight before her hired man dug out one more page of it. So there it is. That's the whole of what I came in here to say. And now—" She pressed her back against the door. "Now you can say whatever you need to say. I'll not blame you for any of it." For a long moment, Nathaniel Harrow did not move. He stood behind his desk with his face unreadable, and Elizabeth waited, hardly breathing, for the thing she'd braced for. The hurt, the anger, the terrible slow understanding of a man who'd been lied to one time too many, the look she'd seen on faces her whole life, the moment the mask came off and they saw what she really was. It did not come. Instead, Nathaniel Harrow came slow around the desk and crossed the room to her and stopped an arm's length away and asked her the one question she had not in all her bracing prepared herself for. "What were you running from?" Elizabeth blinked. "What? 3 years ago, when you buried your name and built the story and came into this county with nothing." His voice was very quiet, very level. "You didn't do all that for sport, Elizabeth. A woman doesn't cut away her whole self and start again from bare ground unless the thing behind her is so bad that being nobody is safer than being who she was. So I'm not going to ask you your real name. You'll tell me when you're ready, or you won't. I'm going to ask you the only thing that matters." He looked into her face. "What were you running from that was so bad you'd rather be nobody than be found?" And Elizabeth Carter, who had braced for judgment and gotten instead the one man in the world who'd thought to ask why, felt something come apart in her chest that she had held shut for 3 years, and she told him. She told him about the husband. She had married Youngs in a county 300 miles east, married a man her family chose because he had money and standing and a good name, the same trade Nathaniel had been raised into. She understood now, the very same cold bargain, except that hers had gone away, his mercifully hadn't. Because the man her family sold her to had been cruel. Cruel in the quiet way, the way that leaves no mark, a magistrate would credit. And then over the years, cruel in the loud way too, the way that broke bones, her own mother's teaching had had to set in secret. She told Nathaniel about the years of it, about the doctoring she'd learned first on her own body, about the night it had gone far enough that she'd understood with perfect clarity that if she stayed, she would die there, and no one would call it murder, and her husband would marry again inside a year. "So I ran," she said, and her voice was steady now, worn past weeping. I waited till he was deep in drink, and I took what little I could carry, and I ran in the night same as I ran into your carriage, except that time there was no one waiting to catch me, and I knew he'd hunt me. A man like that doesn't lose a possession quiet, so I couldn't just move. I had to disappear. I had to kill the woman he owned and build a new one he'd never find, and that's Elizabeth Carter. That's the name I took off a headstone in a churchyard 200 miles from here. A real Elizabeth Carter who died a child. And I gave myself her honest farm and her honest dead father, because a woman with a sad, simple history is a woman nobody looks at twice. She met his eyes. So that's it, Nathaniel. That's the whole of what Cordelia's man is digging toward. Not a fraud for money. A woman still married in the eyes of the law to a man 300 miles away who'd drag her back to her death if he knew where she was. That's why I couldn't say yes to you last night. Because I can't marry you. I've already got a husband. And even if I hadn't, even if he were dead, I'm a woman who'd have to stand up before God and give a false name in a true vow, and I couldn't do that to you. I couldn't make our whole marriage the one lie I never got out from under. The study was utterly silent, and Nathaniel Harrow, when he finally spoke, did not speak of the law or the marriage or the name or any of the wreckage she'd laid at his feet. He said very low, "What was his name?" And it was the exact voice Elizabeth realized with a jolt. The exact low, cold, terrible voice he'd used in the carriage that very first night when she'd told him about the men and the wager, and he'd asked, "What are their names?" in the tone of a man asking who he means to ruin. "No," she said. "Nathaniel, no. You can't. If you go after him, you tell him where I am. That's the one thing I can never let happen. Do you understand me? He can't know where I am. That's the whole of why I've stayed alive 3 years. He put his hands on you." Nathaniel's voice shook, and it was not fear that shook it. "For years, and the law let him. And you had to learn your own doctoring on the bones he broke." He turned away, and his hands had closed to fists, and when he turned back, his eyes were wet and blazing both at once. "You want to know the thing that's breaking my heart right now, Elizabeth? It's not the false name. I don't give one damn about the false name. I'd have taken you under any name you cared to give, and you know it. You've known it for weeks. It's not even that we can't marry, though. God knows I'll have something to say to God about that before I'm done." His voice cracked clean through. "It's that you've spent every single day I've known you bracing. I watched it and I couldn't name it. That flinch when Mrs. Doyle wrapped a blanket round you. The way you go still as stone when a man raises his voice even in kindness. The way you asked me for a lock on your door that first night, and I thought it was your virtue you were guarding, and it was your life." He pressed the heel of his hand to his eyes. "You've been so brave for so long that you forgot bravery's supposed to have an end, a place you get to lay it down. And I've had you in my house for 2 months believing you were finally safe, and the whole time some part of you was still listening for his step on the stair, wasn't it? Tell me the truth. Wasn't it?" And Elizabeth Carter, who had not once broken in front of another living soul over the true thing, not in 3 years, put her hands over her face and nodded and could not speak. Nathaniel crossed the room and did not touch her. He stopped just short so she could feel him there without a hand on her, and he said very gently, "May I hold you? You can say no. You can always say no. That's the first thing that's going to be true in this house from now on. You can always say no, and nothing bad happens after." And Elizabeth, weeping, said, "Yes." And he gathered her in careful, as a man handling something broken, and held her, while 3 years of it, and more than 3, a whole life of it, came out of her against his chest. When she had spent it, and could speak again, she pulled back and wiped her face and said, "It changes everything. You see that now, don't you? It's not the town's lie that ruins us, it's the true one. I can't be your wife. There's a man alive who's my husband-in-law, and until that's not so, I can't stand up before anyone. And Cordelia knows I'm hiding something, even if she hasn't found what. She'll dig till she finds it. And when she finds a living husband 300 miles east Nathaniel, she doesn't just shame me. She can send for him." Elizabeth's voice dropped to horror. That's the true weapon in her hand, and she doesn't even know yet how sharp it is. She thinks she's holding a false name. She's holding my death. The moment she finds him and writes to him, she puts a rope round my neck, and there's not a court in this country that'd call it wrong, because in the eyes of the law, I'm a runaway wife, and he's my lawful husband, and he can do with me as he pleases. Nathaniel had gone very still. How long, he said slowly, before her man finds him? I don't know. Weeks, days. I covered my trail as well as a frightened girl knew how 3 years ago, but a paid man with deep pockets, I don't know Nathaniel. Not long enough. That's why I have to run. Tonight. It's the only thing that keeps him from, no. Nathaniel. I said no, and I'll tell you why, and then you can argue with me if you've the strength left. He took her hands. You've spent 3 years running because running was the only tool a frightened girl alone could reach. Alone it was the right choice, the only one. But you are not alone anymore. Elizabeth, and running is the one thing that keeps this true forever. You run tonight, and you're running the rest of your life. New name, new county, new story, forever bracing for the step on the stair. And I'm not in it, and neither's Mrs. Doyle, nor the Renners, nor one soul that loves you. That's not survival. That's just a slower way of letting him kill you. His hands tightened. There's another way. And it's the harder one, and it's the one that ends it instead of outrunning it. We don't hide from Cordelia's man. We get to your husband first. With everything I've got, and I've got a great deal, Elizabeth and I have never once in my life had a thing worth spending it on until now. Get to him and do what you can't. Nathaniel, you can't fix a marriage that's legal. The law's the law. He owns me. That's the whole horror of it. The law's the law, Nathaniel agreed. But the law's also got more doors than a frightened girl running in the night ever had time to try. A man who broke your bones for years. A man like that has left a wake, Elizabeth. Debts. Enemies. Other women he's hurt. Deeds that don't bear looking at. Men like that always have. You escaped him with nothing but your life and your mother's doctoring, so you never had the means to go looking. I do. His voice hardened. There are lawyers who can find grounds for a woman to be freed from a man like that, if a woman's got the money to pay them and the witnesses to stand for her. And after what happened in that courthouse this week, do you doubt for 1 minute that we can find witnesses? There are ways, Elizabeth. Hard, slow, ugly ways. But ways, and every one of them beats you vanishing into the dark alone for the rest of your life. Let me spend what I've got. Let me put the whole of Harrowdean between you and that man. Not to marry you, that comes after, if it comes, and I'd wait 10 years for it. To free you. Just to free you. Will you let me do that? Will you let me be the first person in your whole life who stood between you and him instead of leaving you to run? And Elizabeth Carter looked up into the face of the man she'd fallen into a carriage beside, and understood that he was offering her the one thing she had never once in all her life been offered. Not rescue exactly, because he wasn't taking the fight from her hands. He was offering to stand beside her in it, to make her fight his. To spend everything he had, not to own her the way every other powerful man in her life had wanted to, but to make her free. Cordelia, she managed. She'll expect me gone by tonight. When I'm not, when you're not, she'll do her worst, and we'll be ready for it, because we'll know it's coming, and she'll think she's still got a secret. A hard light came into his eyes. You said it yourself, Elizabeth. She thinks she's holding a false name. She doesn't know she's holding a marriage, so she'll move slow, savoring it, thinking she's got weeks to twist the knife. And every day she thinks that is a day my men are riding east faster than her one thorough fellow ever dreamed. We don't run from her. We outrun her. To your husband. To the lawyers. To the end of this. He lifted her chin gentle. You've been the bravest woman I ever met, running alone in the dark for 3 years. Be a little braver. Stop running. Let me run with you the other direction, straight at the thing you've been fleeing, and let's you and I go and end it. The study was quiet, and then Elizabeth Carter, the name she'd taken off a child's headstone, the name she'd decided in a kitchen among her jars that very afternoon. She would rather keep as her true self than trade for a lie. Took a long breath and stopped running. All right, she whispered. All right, Nathaniel. We do it your way. We go at him." Her voice steadied, and something came into it that had never been there before. Not the courage of a woman enduring, but the courage of a woman who means to win. "But you listen to me now and you hear me. When we get to him, when your lawyers and your money and your witnesses have got him cornered, I stand up. Not you, me. I'll take your help and your men and every dollar you'll spend, and I'll be grateful for it every day of my life. But when the moment comes to look that man in the eye and take my own self back from him, that's mine. I've earned it. 3 years and a lifetime, I've earned the right to be the one who ends it. You'll not do it for me. You'll do it with me. Is that a bargain?" And Nathaniel Harrow, who had spent his whole life being told that a powerful man's love meant taking a woman's fights away from her, looked at the woman who'd just taught him different and felt something in his chest come the rest of the way home. "That's a bargain," he said. "God help the man. He owned a frightened girl once." A slow, hard, wondering smile. "He's got no earthly idea what's riding east to meet him now." Outside the study window, the last light was going off the range, and somewhere out past the gates, a hired man was writing a careful letter to a county 300 miles east and did not know that he was already too late, that the frightened woman he'd been paid to expose had that very evening stopped being frightened at last. The letter reached the county 300 miles east 11 days later, and by then it was already useless because Nathaniel Harrow's men had been there 9. That was the thing Cordelia Aldridge had never reckoned on. She had one thorough man and deep pockets. Nathaniel had a dozen riders, a fortune he had never once had a reason to spend, and a woman guiding him who knew exactly which stones to turn over because Elizabeth had lived under those stones. She knew the county. She knew the man. She knew better than any hired investigator where the bodies of Josiah Vane's cruelty were buried because she had helped bury a few of them herself in secret on her own broken bones. Josiah Vane. She said the name aloud to Nathaniel the night they made their plan, and it cost her something to say it, and when it was out, she found it cost her a little less than she'd feared. "That's his name," she said. "Josiah Vane. And here's what you'll find when your men go east, because I know it the way you know, a thing you've lived. He's a respected man there, owns half the mill trade in the county, sits in the front pew. And every soul who's ever done business with him is afraid of him, and a good number of them hate him. And not one has ever had the money or the standing to stand up to him." Her voice hardened. "There'll be others. Other women. A man like that doesn't stop at a wife. There'll be hands he's crippled, and never paid for it, girls in his employ. He's ruined partners. He's cheated. Who swallowed it because he held their paper. Your men won't have to invent a thing, Nathaniel. They'll only have to find the people who've been waiting years for somebody with the means to ask." She was right. The reports came back over the following weeks carried by hard-riding men, and each one was worse than the last, and each one was also, in its terrible way, a gift because each one was a person. A miller's widow, whose husband had died in a fire at Vane's works the same week he'd threatened to talk about Vane's books. 2 former housemaids' girls now who wept when Nathaniel's man said the word Vane, and then when they understood he'd come to help build a case and not to silence them, talked for 3 hours straight. A doctor, a real one with a diploma, who had treated injuries on Josiah Vane's first wife, the one before Elizabeth, the one who had died young of a fall, and who had never once believed it was a fall, and had carried that unspoken for 20 years like a stone in his own chest. His first wife, Elizabeth whispered when that report came. She had gone white. "There was a first wife. I knew there'd been one. He told me she died, but he never said." She looked up at Nathaniel with dawning horror. "A fall. Nathaniel. It was going to be a fall. That's what mine would have been. That's what he was working up to. I ran the night I understood there'd be a fall coming for me too. I never knew there'd already been one." Nathaniel took her hands. "Then you're not just saving yourself. You understand that now. Every witness we find, every page we build, it's not just to free you. It's for a dead woman 20 years in the ground that nobody ever stood up for. You ran so you wouldn't be her. Now you're going to make sure she gets the justice she never got." His voice was low. "You still want to be the one who stands up when the moment comes." More than ever, Elizabeth said. More than ever now. Cordelia Aldridge, meanwhile, was losing her mind by slow degrees, and it was one of the few pleasures Elizabeth allowed herself in those hard weeks, because Cordelia had expected her gone, had gone to bed the night of her threat, certain that by morning the Carter woman would have vanished, note left heartbroken field cleared. And instead, Elizabeth had stayed and gone on doctoring and gone on walking into town with her chin up, and given Cordelia not one sign of the terror the woman had been so sure she'd planted. It unnerved her. It was meant to. She'll crack, Elizabeth told Nathaniel. She thinks she's holding a secret so terrible I'd run rather than face it. And I'm not running, and she can't understand why, and it's eating her alive. A person like Cordelia can't abide being confused. She'll do something rash to force my hand. Watch. Cordelia did something rash. She came back to Harrowdean a second time, 3 weeks in, and this time she did not come clever and quiet. She came furious, and she came in daylight, and she made the mistake, the fatal mistake of doing it in front of witnesses. She found Elizabeth in the yard, with half the ranch about Mrs. Doyle at the kitchen door, and Eli Renner mending tack, and a dozen hands in earshot, and she did not lower her voice at all. "You think you're clever," Cordelia said, sweeping up gloves already off. "You think staying puts is some kind of courage. Let me tell you what it is. It's stupidity. I gave you a way out, you ungrateful little fraud, and you spat on it, so now I'll do exactly what I promised. I'll hand Nathaniel Harrow every filthy page of who you really are, and I'll—" "Go on, then." Elizabeth did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She set down her basket and turned and faced Cordelia full, and the whole yard went quiet to listen. "Hand it to him. Every page. I'll save you the trouble, in fact he already knows." Cordelia's mouth stopped. "He knows," Elizabeth said again, clear enough for the whole yard. "He's known for 3 weeks. I told him myself the very night you came to my kitchen and thought you'd frightened me. Everything you were saving up to wound him with the false name, the built history, the whole of it, he heard it from my own mouth before your thorough man could dig out a word of it. So there's your weapon, Cordelia. Go on and fire it. It's already spent." She stepped closer, and now her voice did drop, but hard, so only the near ones caught it. "You built your whole hand on the belief that I'd rather die keeping a secret than live having told it. You had me exactly wrong. I've spent my whole life being made small by people who knew a thing about me I was ashamed of. I'm done being small. I told the truth, and it didn't destroy me. And now you've got nothing, nothing at all, because you can't threaten a person with a secret she's already given away." And Cordelia Aldridge stood in that yard in front of a dozen witnesses, with her one great weapon turned to ash in her hand, and did the thing that finished her. She lost her temper entirely. "You stupid, low, common little nothing!" She spat loud, shrill, all the practiced silk gone. "You think he loves you. He pities you. You think this is a life. You're a runaway wife is what you are. Oh, I know that much. My man found the marriage. I know you've a husband still living, and when Josiah Vane comes to collect, what's his? Your precious Nathaniel Harrow will—" She stopped, because she'd said it. In front of the whole yard, she'd said the name, and every soul in that yard heard the daughter of Silas Aldridge shriek in a fury that Elizabeth had a living husband heard her name, him, heard her all but promise to send for him. Mrs. Doyle's hand had gone to her mouth. Eli Renner had risen slow from his tack, his face darkening. And Elizabeth stood very still and felt not the fear Cordelia had meant to raise, but something colder and cleaner, because Cordelia Aldridge in her rage had just confessed before a dozen witnesses that she knew of Josiah Vane and meant to bring him down on Elizabeth's head. Which was a thing a court could hear. Which was a thing a lawyer could use. "Thank you," Elizabeth said quietly. "What? You just told a yard full of witnesses that you know where a violent man is, and that you mean to send him after a woman you know he's hurt so that he can hurt her again." Elizabeth's voice was steady as stone. "There's a word for that, Cordelia. It's the same word for what your father tried in that courtroom, only worse, because you've named the weapon out loud. I don't imagine you thought this through. People like you never do think a person like me might have somewhere to take a thing you've said. But I do now. I've got lawyers. Cordelia, real ones, the kind your father used to be the only one in the county rich enough to buy. And they are going to be very interested in what you just shouted in front of Eli Renner and Mrs. Doyle and half of Harrowdean. She turned away. Go home. Go home and tell your father the frightened woman found her feet. And tell him the next time an Aldridge tries to use a violent man to destroy a woman, there'll be a witness list a mile long. Go on. You're done here. Cordelia Aldridge stood alone in that yard a moment longer, her face gone through fury into something like fear. Understanding at last that she had walked into a trap that the woman she'd come to destroy had set weeks ago and baited with her own silence. And then she turned and she fled, and she did not come back to Harrowdean again. The reckoning with Josiah Vane did not happen in a courthouse in the end. Elizabeth had braced for it to. She had prepared herself over those hard weeks to stand up in some cold formal room and face the man across a rail. But cruelty of Vane's kind, when it is finally dragged into the light, rarely gets the dignity of a trial. It collapses instead all at once the way a rotten beam collapses the moment the weight it's been hiding is finally set upon it. Nathaniel's lawyers moved in the late autumn all at once in the county 300 miles east. They did not go to Vane. They went around him to the sheriff with the doctor's 20-year-old testimony about a first wife's fall. To the county court with the sworn statements of 2 former housemaids and a miller's widow. To Vane's creditors and partners, quietly letting it be known that a man with a fortune behind him was building a case, and that anyone who'd been waiting years for the cover to speak against Josiah Vane now had it. And the thing Elizabeth had predicted came true. Exactly. The men who feared him once they saw he could be beaten turned on him in a rush, because fear reversed becomes the fiercest thing of all. Vane was arrested for the murder of his first wife within the month. Not for what he'd done to Elizabeth. The law still cared little enough about that. But for the woman 20 years dead, the fall that had never been a fall, whose brother had kept a blood-stained thing in a locked box for 2 decades, waiting for a day that never seemed to come, and had now finally come. The case was not certain. These things never are. But it did not have to be certain to do the one thing that mattered to Elizabeth. It gave her grounds, because a woman married to a man imprisoned and disgraced a man against whom a whole county had finally risen. A man whose cruelty was suddenly a matter of sworn public record. That woman could be freed. It took lawyers and months and more of Nathaniel's fortune than he would ever tell her the size of. But there was a door exactly as he'd promised there would be, and they went through it. And on a cold, clear morning the following spring, a court in a county 300 miles east dissolved the marriage of Josiah Vane and the woman he had bought on grounds of his cruelty and his crimes, and set her legally free. She was not there to see it. Her lawyers stood for her. She had wanted at first to go to look the man in the eye the way she'd sworn she would. But somewhere in the long grinding months of it that need had quietly left her, and she understood why she had thought once that taking herself back required standing before him. And it didn't. That had been the old thinking. The thinking of a woman who still believed her freedom was a thing he held, and she'd have to wrest from his hands. She knew better now. Her freedom had never been his to give or hold. It had only ever been hers waiting. So she let the lawyers stand for her, and she stayed at Harrowdean, and on the morning the word came by rider that it was done, that she was free, that the name of Vane no longer touched her, that Josiah Vane would very likely hang, and could in any case never again touch a living soul. Elizabeth Carter walked out into the yard, where 2 months of her true story had first spilled into the open, and she stood in the spring morning, and for the first time in her whole remembered life, she was not bracing for anything at all. Nathaniel found her there. "It's done," he said. He'd read the letter. His voice was rough. "You're free, Elizabeth. It's over. He can never—" "I know." She turned to him, and her face was wet, and she was smiling. "I know. I felt it the moment the rider came up the drive. I've been standing here trying to remember how to stand when I'm not listening for a step behind me, and I—" She laughed unsteady. I don't rightly know how. Isn't that a thing? 3 years I dreamed of this, and now it's come, and I don't know how to hold my own shoulders. You'll learn. He took her hands. You've got time now, all the time there is.
What on they?
He asked her again in the summer. He did it in the same yard on an evening much like the one a year before, when he'd first asked, and she'd had to tell him, no fiddle music going soft, the first star's out. Little Mercy Renner, grown a whole year gap-toothed now, where she'd lost a tooth, refusing as ever to be pried from Elizabeth's skirts. But this time, there was no shadow of a folded paper in it, no secret sitting cold in Elizabeth's chest, no husband, 300 miles east. There was only the two of them, and the truth all the way down, and a name that was hers to give the one she'd taken off a child's headstone and made through a year of standing up under it entirely her own. I asked you once before in this very spot, Nathaniel said, and you told me you needed 3 days, and it like to broke my heart, though I understood after why you couldn't say yes. He held both her hands. I'll not ask you for 3 days this time. I'll not ask you to be sure of anything but the one thing. Elizabeth Carter and I know it's a name you took, and I've thought about that, and I've decided I don't care because you've spent a year making it truer than the one you were born to. It's yours now. You earned it. I'd be proud to give you mine to go beside it. His voice went unsteady. Marry me. There's no secret left to settle. No shadow. Nothing on this earth between us now but a plain question asked in the open in front of God and everyone we love. Will you be my wife? And Elizabeth Carter, who had run out into a storm 2 summers before to disappear, who had fallen into the wrong carriage and been seen instead of vanishing, who had told the truth when a lie would have been safer and stopped running, when running was all she knew, looked up into the face of the man who had never once tried to make her small and said the word she had wanted to say for a year and finally could. Yes, she said. Oh, Nathaniel, yes. And the yard came apart around them. Mrs. Doyle weeping openly into her apron, Eli Renner letting out a whoop that startled the horses, the fiddle scraping up into something bright and fast. Little Mercy shrieking with joy without the least idea why. And Nathaniel Harrow lifted the woman he loved clean off her feet and turned her round in a circle under the first summer stars. And for the first time since anyone at Harrowdene could remember, and for a great many times after the whole county heard the richest, coldest, most solitary man in 3 counties laugh out loud, just as she'd asked him to that first night in the dark of the carriage. She'd told him she wanted only one thing from him, that he'd laugh again. He never did stop after that. They married in the autumn, in the little church where a preacher had once called her the devil from his pulpit, and Reverend Coy did not perform the ceremony, having been quietly encouraged to seek a congregation in some other county after the truth of the Aldridge business came out. But a new young reverend did one who knew Elizabeth only as the woman half the county owed their children's lives to. The church was full past its walls. The town that had once turned out to watch her destroyed turned out instead to watch her wed, and if some of them had the grace to be ashamed of the difference, well, Elizabeth found she had no more room in her for their shame than she'd had for their cruelty. She had stopped some time in that long, hard year measuring herself by what the town thought of her at all. That more than the marriage, more than even her freedom, was the true breaking of the chain. Silas Aldridge sold up and left the county within the year. His influence broken. His notes called in by men no longer afraid of him now that Nathaniel Harrow had shown it could be done. Cordelia went with him, unmarried, and Elizabeth never heard her name again and did not go looking for it. She found, to her mild surprise, that she wished the woman no particular ill. Cordelia had been raised the same as Amelia had been, the same as Nathaniel. Nearly was raised to believe a person was a thing to be traded and joined and used, and if it had made her cruel, well, Elizabeth of all people knew what cruelty grew from. She had been married to its purest form for 6 years. She could afford now, from the far side of her whole free life, a little pity for the woman who'd tried to send it back to her door. Whitmore Harrowdene became in the years that followed a different place entirely. Elizabeth had said once in a carriage in the rain that a family cold and damp all winter is a family sick all winter, and it wasn't the Lord's doing, it was the roofing. She spent the next 20 years fixing the roofing of the whole county. Not the literal roofs, though those too, but the deeper thing. She built with Nathaniel's fortune behind her and her own hard sense guiding it, the first proper infirmary in 3 counties. A plain, clean building where any soul could come and be treated whether they had a coin or not, and where she trained up other women in the doctoring her mother had taught her, so that the knowledge that had saved Mercy Renner and old Mrs. Pruitt and the Bergen boy would not die when Elizabeth did. Girls came to her from all over. Some of them came the way she'd come once in the night, with a story that didn't hold up, and a fear behind their eyes she recognized on sight, and those ones she never turned away and never questioned, and gave a locked room and a hot meal, and when they were ready, a place to stand up under a name that was theirs. She never forgot what it was to be the woman in the corner. That was the thing that made her great in the end. Not that she'd risen, but that she remembered exactly all her life, the cold of the floor she'd risen from and spent every year after making sure fewer women had to lie on it. They grew old together at Harrowdean. That was the part that still some evenings took Elizabeth's breath, the sheer ordinary length of it. The years, the seasons turning over the range, the gray coming into Nathaniel's dark hair, and then into her own brown. Children they had 3, and raised a 4th, Mercy Renner, having lost her mother young, and found a second home in the big house, and then the children's children filling the rooms of the great house that had once stood so empty, a lonely man rattled around in it, like the last bean in a jar. And every so often at a gathering, when the house was full and warm and loud, some young person who didn't know the story would ask how the 2 of them had met the richest man in 3 counties, and the county's beloved doctor woman, and the room would go quiet and knowing, because everyone who'd been around long enough knew and loved to hear it told again, and Nathaniel would tell it. He never tired of telling it. How a soaked, shoeless woman had wrenched open his carriage door on the worst night of her life and gasped, "Wrong carriage, forgive me," and how he'd looked at her. This frightened, furious, unwanted woman who wanted nothing from him at all, and heard himself say, out of some part of him he'd thought was dead 7 years. The right one, actually, and the young people would laugh and sigh, and someone would always say what a lucky accident it had been, what a stroke of fortune that she'd opened the wrong door. And here, every time without fail for 40 years, Nathaniel Harrow would shake his head and reach for his wife's hand and correct them. It was never the wrong carriage, he'd say, and Elizabeth old, now silver-haired, her hands worn from a lifetime of mending other people's hurts. The same hands that had once clutched a pair of ruined shoes to her chest as she ran from a room full of laughter, Elizabeth would squeeze his hand and finish it, the way she'd finished it 1,000 times. The way she would go on finishing it until the day one of them was left to finish it alone. "I thought I was running away from my shame," she'd say. From being nobody. From a whole life of being made small. She'd look around the warm, full, loud room at the children and the grandchildren, at Mercy Renner, grown and gray herself now, at the infirmary lights burning steady down the road, where some other frightened girl was that very night being told she was safe. But I wasn't running away from anything in the end. A pause. The old sure smile. I was running home, I just hadn't met it yet, and that was the truth of it, and the whole of it, and the last of it. That the woman a whole town had once bet no decent man would cross a room for, had walked no, had run shoeless and shamed, and certain she was nobody straight into the one life that had been waiting all along to prove them wrong. That worth was never a thing the world got to hand out or take back. That the person everyone overlooks, the one made smallest by the cruelty and the carelessness of comfortable people, may carry inside her the very thing that heals a whole county and warms a whole cold house and teaches a hard and lonely man to laugh again after 7 silent years. She had opened the wrong door and found behind it every right thing she'd ever been told she didn't deserve. Elizabeth Carter was never nobody. She had only for a while believed the people who said so, And then one storm-soaked night she stopped.